Hey, sleepyheads. Hope your day was great. Before we start, let's play a game. Comment the time where you are right now and whether you should be asleep already. Let's see who's the biggest night owl. Before you settle in, tap that like button and subscribe to keep the cozy vibes coming. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's drift into sleep. We had been planning this trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a break from everything work, screens, noise, just the four of us, a tent, and miles of untouched wilderness. Josh was the one who found the spot. He had this way of always knowing the best hidden trails, the places that didn't show up on official maps. "No one goes out this far," he had said when we packed up the car, his usual confident grin stretching across his face. "It's perfect." At first he was right. The first day was everything we wanted it to be. The hike up was long, exhausting, but the air was crisp, the trees swayed lazily in the wind, and the distant peaks of the mountains stood like ancient guardians in the distance. We set up camp in a small clearing tucked away between thick pines, the kind of place where you could actually hear silence, not the kind that exists in cities, broken by the hum of electricity and the occasional siren. But true, untouched quiet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a fire, pulled out the beers, and let ourselves breathe. It felt good to be out there. Just us and the wild. That night, I woke up needing to piss. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, careful not to wake the others. The fire had died down to glowing embers, sending faint flickers of orange into the night. The air had turned colder than I expected. I stepped out of the tent, stretching, listening to the quiet hum of the forest. Leaves rustled somewhere nearby, probably a rabbit or something small moving in the undergrowth. I walked a little past the tree line, far enough that I wouldn't wake the others, but not so far that I'd get turned around in the dark. As I finished, shaking the last bit of grogginess from my head, I turned back toward camp. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing just beyond the trees. My brain took a second to process it. He wasn't moving. He wasn't doing anything. He was just there. Not hiking, not holding a flashlight or any kind of gear, just standing in the dark, motionless. Watching. A sudden chill ran through me. "Hello?" My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. He didn't respond. Didn't move. I took a step forward, squinting through the dim light. The fire behind me cast just enough glow to outline his form. He was tall, too tall. Something about the way he stood there felt wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural, his arms resting perfectly at his sides, his head tilted slightly forward. I swallowed. "Hey man, you okay?" Nothing. No reaction. He didn't shift his weight, didn't blink. The unease in my gut twisted into something heavier, something primal. I took a slow step backward, resisting the urge to turn and run. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my flashlight, and flicked it on. The beam hit the trees, bouncing off bark and leaves, but when it landed on him, there was nothing there. The man was gone. The trees stood empty, the undergrowth undisturbed. No movement, no sound. I stood there, frozen. For a moment, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me, the flickering firelight warping the forest into something it wasn't. But when I turned back toward camp, my heart nearly stopped. Josh was awake, sitting up in his sleeping bag. His eyes were wide. "You saw him too," he whispered. I nodded slowly. Neither of us said anything else. Neither of us slept. By morning it almost felt stupid to talk about. Almost. Chris and Devin were still passed out when Josh and I finally crawled out of the tent, stretching under the pale morning light. Josh ran a hand through his messy hair, his jaw tight. "You're sure you saw him?" I looked at him, irritated. "You were awake too." He hesitated. "Yeah, but maybe it was just..." "Just what?" He didn't answer. We let it drop. By the time Chris and Devin woke up, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. We had coffee, made breakfast, packed up some gear for a short hike. No one mentioned the man in the trees. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened. The second night, we sat around the fire again, passing a bottle of whiskey between us, laughing at stories we had all heard 100 times before. But something felt different. The air had changed. Even Devin, who never shut up, was quieter than usual. Josh kept glancing toward the woods, his shoulders tense. I knew exactly what he was thinking. Then, at some point, Chris stopped mid-sentence, his face suddenly blank. We all turned to look at him. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking past us, into the trees. I turned slowly, dread creeping up my spine. And there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing, still, silent, watching. The fire crackled. Devin swore under his breath. Josh was the first to break the silence. "Hey man, who are you?" The man didn't move, didn't speak. Just like before, a heavy silence settled over us. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. Devin forced a laugh, but it sounded weak. "Dude, are you lost?" "Nothing." He didn't shift, didn't react. Chris stood up, his voice sharp. "Hey, we're talking to you." Still no response. I could feel my hands curling into fists. My body screamed at me to do something. Then, in the flickering light of the fire, I noticed something. He wasn't blinking. Not once. Not at all. A sick, twisted feeling settled in my gut. People blink. They always blink. Josh stood up next to Chris. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Let's go inside the tent." Devin scoffed. "Seriously? He's just some guy." But there was no conviction in his voice. Josh ignored him and took a step back toward the tent. Chris followed. Devin hesitated, then muttered a curse and stomped after them. I stayed still. For just a moment longer, I kept my eyes on the man in the woods. His face was barely visible, just a shadow beyond the trees. But I swore I saw something change. His head tilted slightly, like he knew we were afraid. Like he liked it. I turned and followed the others, my chest tight. We crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and sat there in silence. No one spoke. The fire outside burned lower. Through the thin fabric, I could still see the faint glow of the embers. And beyond that, a dark, motionless figure, standing just beyond the light, waiting. Nobody slept. The four of us sat inside the tent, the fabric stretching thin around us, the flickering light from the dying fire outside barely visible through the mesh of the entrance. It should have felt cramped, but there was enough space for our fear to settle in between us, thick and suffocating. Devin kept shifting, his knee bouncing, arms crossed tight over his chest. Every so often, he muttered a quiet, nervous laugh under his breath, like he was trying to convince himself this was all a joke. Josh was silent, sitting with his back pressed against the tent wall, staring down at his hands. He had always been the one to keep a cool head, the guy who thrived in the wilderness. Now he looked like he had no idea what to do. Chris had his knife out. It was small, the kind of thing you kept for cutting rope or fishing line, but he gripped it like it could actually protect him from something bigger, something he couldn't understand. And then there was me. I was still trying to piece together what I had seen. The man in the woods hadn't moved, not once, not when we yelled at him, not when we stared, and he never blinked. I could feel it in my chest, that gut-deep certainty. He wasn't just standing there for no reason. He had been watching. And he was still out there. Josh exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "We need to leave first thing in the morning." His voice was quieter than usual, like he didn't want to be heard. Chris gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think?" He ran a hand through his hair, fingers twitching. "This is messed up. What if he—" Nobody wanted him to finish the sentence. "What if he comes closer? What if he doesn't? What if he just stays there? Watching?" A soft crack outside made everyone freeze. Not the snap of a fire dying, not the rustle of wind. A footstep. Josh clenched his jaw and shook his head. "No way," he whispered. We all sat there, waiting. Then another. Closer. I grabbed Harvey by the collar. He had been curled up next to me the whole time, but now he was alert, his ears standing straight up, his body tensed. He let out a low, quiet whimper, something deep and instinctual. Chris shifted, gripping his knife tighter. Devin whispered, "If this is some kind of backwoods psycho messing with us, I swear to." Another step. Right outside the tent. I could hear my own breathing. Harvey let out a low growl. Josh raised a hand, signaling for everyone to stay still. He turned his head toward me, mouthed the flashlight. I hesitated, then slowly reached for it. The moment my fingers wrapped around the handle, the sound stopped. No more steps. No rustling. Just the distant sounds of the forest, the quiet hum of crickets, the faint swaying of trees in the breeze. Like nothing had ever been there. But we knew better. Nobody moved. Chris let out a shaky breath. "This is—" Josh cut him off. "We're not doing this. We're not playing into it." His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. He looked at me again. "Turn on the flashlight." I swallowed the lump in my throat and flicked it on. The light cut through the tent wall, casting a pale glow outside. Nothing. Just the trees, the dirt, the fire pit, still smoldering with dying embers. Devin let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Screw this, man." Chris looked at him. "So you're just gonna pretend we didn't hear that? Maybe it was an animal." Josh's head snapped toward him. "That wasn't an animal." A beat of silence. Nobody wanted to say what we were all thinking. We weren't alone. And whatever was out there, it didn't leave. It was waiting. Josh cleared his throat. "We pack up at sunrise. We move fast. No stopping, no messing around. Agreed?" We nodded. None of us were getting any sleep tonight. The morning came too slow. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I opened my eyes the sky was turning gray, the faint glow of morning creeping over the trees. Josh was already up, stuffing his sleeping bag into his pack. Chris and Devin were groggy, but they didn't argue. Nobody joked about what had happened. Nobody even looked toward the tree line. We moved quickly, shoving everything into our bags, stomping out what remained of the fire. I rolled up my mat and glanced around the campsite one last time, my gut telling me something felt off. Then I saw the footprints. They were in the dirt, just beyond our tent. Deep, clear, fresh. Josh must have seen them at the same time, because he stopped packing. We looked at each other. Neither of us said anything. There were no trails around here. No roads. No other hikers. And these weren't our footprints. Chris and Devin noticed too. Nobody moved. Then Devin forced a nervous laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Whatever, man. Maybe some weirdo just." He cut himself off, because that was when we noticed the other set of prints, right next to the first ones, side by side. Like whoever had been standing out there last night wasn't alone. We left. Fast. Nobody ran, but it was close. We stuck together, moving at a steady pace, eyes straight ahead. We should have been making conversation. Someone should have cracked a joke, made a comment about breakfast, complained about the weight of their pack. But nobody spoke. Harvey was tense, his ears still flicking back toward the trees. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. We hiked for hours, but it felt longer. The sky turned brighter, the air warmer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Like we were being followed. Not close enough to hear. Not close enough to see. But there. Present. We didn't stop for lunch. We didn't stop for anything. Josh didn't even check the map. He just kept walking. Chris muttered under his breath, his hands gripping the straps of his pack too tight. Devin kept looking over his shoulder. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to tell him that if he kept checking, eventually, he was going to see something. And I was scared that if we saw it again this time, it wasn't going to just stand there. We reached the car by early afternoon. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until we were inside, the doors shut and locked. Nobody spoke. Nobody even looked at each other. Josh turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. We left without a word. The trees blurred past the windows as we sped down the dirt road, the mountains shrinking behind us. We didn't look back. We didn't want to see if something was still there. The drive back was dead silent. Josh kept his hands tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. Chris sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead like he was afraid to blink. Devin had his hoodie pulled up, slumped against the window, but I knew he wasn't asleep. Nobody was. Harvey had wedged himself between me and the door in the back seat, his body pressed against my leg like he was making sure I was still there. Nobody wanted to talk about what had happened. The footprints, the man in the trees, the fact that we had no idea if here they had followed us out. Josh was driving faster than he should have down the winding mountain road, but nobody told him to slow down. We wanted out. And none of us were going to be the one to say we felt like we weren't alone. I didn't turn around, didn't check the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if something was there. Because if I saw something standing at the edge of the trees, watching our car disappear, I don't know if I would have ever slept again. We finally hit the main highway, and it was like someone let the air out of the car. Josh exhaled, long and slow, like he had been holding his breath the whole time. Chris sat back, rubbing his face with his hands. Devin shifted, sitting up straighter, pulling his hoodie down. Nobody said it out loud, but we all felt the same thing. The air felt lighter, like we had left something behind, or like something had let us go. I stared out the window, watching the trees thin as we got closer to town, trying to push the last 2 nights out of my head. I kept telling myself it was over. It should have been over. But then, just as we passed the first gas station in miles, Josh spoke for the first time in hours. His voice was hoarse, rough. "We stopping here?" Nobody answered right away. Devin finally cleared his throat. Yeah, I gotta take a piss." Chris nodded. "I could use a coffee." I didn't need anything. I didn't want to stop. But we had been hiking since sunrise, and my legs were still stiff from sitting in the car for so long. I exhaled, forcing my body to relax. It was just a gas station. Everything was fine now. Josh pulled into the lot, parking near the front doors. The gas station was the kind you only saw on long, empty highways, sold and quiet, a flickering open 24 hours sign buzzing faintly above the door. The lot was mostly empty, except for a truck parked near the pumps. No other hikers, no signs of anyone who had been in the mountains with us. We climbed out of the car. Harvey jumped down beside me, shaking himself off, tail wagging slightly now that we were somewhere familiar. He seemed calmer. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Devin disappeared inside first. Josh followed, muttering something about stretching his legs. Chris hovered near the door, checking his phone like he suddenly cared about texts he had ignored all weekend. I hesitated before going in, staring out at the highway. The road stretched long and empty in both directions, only broken by rolling hills and patches of forest. I let out a breath. We were fine. We were out. I turned to follow the others inside, but as I stepped through the doorway, Harvey suddenly let out a low growl. Not loud, not aggressive, but warning. I froze. Harvey was still standing outside the entrance, his ears pinned back, staring across the parking lot. I turned, my pulse quickening. The truck. A man was sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't see his face, not fully. The angle of the windshield and the glare from the sun made it hard to tell what he looked like. But he wasn't moving. Just sitting there, watching. Something in my gut twisted. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. He was probably just another traveler, another camper, someone who had been driving for hours and pulled over to rest. But something about the way he was sitting completely motionless sent a ripple of unease through me. Like he had been waiting for us. Like he had known we would stop here. Harvey let out another quiet growl, then whined, stepping closer to me. I finally looked away and headed inside. The gas station was small but bright, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. The smell of stale coffee and cleaning chemicals lingered in the air. Josh was near the coolers, grabbing a bottle of water. Chris was at the counter, talking to the cashier, a bored-looking woman in her 50s. Devin was nowhere to be seen. I grabbed a pack of gum just to have something in my hands, then wandered toward the counter. Chris glanced at me. "Dude, they don't have an ATM. Do you have cash?" I shook my head. "Use your card." Chris sighed but didn't argue. Josh walked up beside us, twisting off the cap of his water. "How much longer you think it'll take to get back?" 2 hours, give or take, Chris muttered. Josh nodded. "Good." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. None of us wanted to talk about it. Not in front of other people. Not yet. I paid for my gum, stuffing it into my jacket pocket, then glanced toward the back of the store. Devin still wasn't back. I turned to Josh. "Where's Devin?" Josh frowned. "Bathroom, I think." Chris checked his watch. "He's been gone a while." The three of us exchanged a glance. Something unspoken passed between us. None of us wanted to check. None of us wanted to go to the back of the store and see if something was wrong. But we did. The bathroom door was closed. Josh knocked. No response. "Devin?" Nothing. Josh glanced at me, then reached for the handle. Locked. "Devin, come on, man. Let's go." Still nothing. Chris stepped back. Maybe he's just. Then the toilet flushed. The sink turned on. The door finally opened. Devin stepped out, his face pale. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. We stared at him. He stared back. I swallowed. "You good?" He nodded, too quickly. Yeah, man. Let's get out of here." Something was wrong. But I wasn't going to ask about it in the middle of a gas station. We walked out together, stepping back into the afternoon sun. The truck was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us the entire time. And I couldn't ignore how Devin wouldn't meet our eyes. Or how, when we got back in the car, he whispered under his breath, almost like he didn't mean for us to hear it. He was in there with me. Nobody responded to what Devin said. We heard him. We knew we heard him. But no one wanted to ask. It was like we had some silent agreement. If we didn't talk about it, we could pretend nothing was wrong. Pretend that we were just four guys driving home from a normal camping trip. Josh started the car, and we pulled onto the highway. The gas station disappeared behind us, swallowed by the empty road. Nobody spoke. Even Harvey, curled up between my feet, seemed tense, his body coiled like he was still waiting for something to happen. Chris finally cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "We're almost home," he muttered, like he was trying to convince himself more than us. Nobody answered. Josh just drove, and Devin sat in the back, staring out the window, his knee bouncing. His face was still pale, his hand still shaking slightly against his jeans. I wanted to ask what happened in that bathroom. I wanted to know if he saw something, but I didn't. Maybe because I was scared of the answer. Maybe because I already knew. We made it back to town just before sunset. Josh pulled into Devin's driveway first, shifting the car into park. "All right, man, you're home." Devin hesitated. His hand rested on the door handle, but he didn't move to get out. Josh turned slightly, frowning. "Dude?" Devin exhaled slowly, then forced a laugh. It sounded fake, forced, like he was trying to make himself believe this was all normal. Yeah, sorry, just tired." Chris chuckled weakly. "Same." Devin opened the door, stepping out. His movements were stiff, like his body was still on edge, still bracing for something. I watched him walk up the steps to his house, fumbling with his keys. The second he got inside, he shut the door too fast, almost like he was locking something out. Josh shifted into drive, glancing at Chris in the passenger seat. "Where am I dropping you?" Chris didn't answer right away. Then he sighed. "I'll crash at my brother's place tonight." Josh nodded. "Good call." Nobody said it out loud, but none of us wanted to be alone. Not yet. Chris was next. Then it was just me, Josh, and Harvey. The car felt smaller with just the three of us. Josh glanced at me. "You need a ride to your place?" I hesitated. Then I shook my head. "I'll crash at yours." He didn't argue. When we got to Josh's place, Harvey practically bolted out of the car, his nails clicking against the pavement as he ran straight to the front door. He had never done that before. Josh unlocked the door, stepping inside first. I followed, closing it behind me. We didn't turn on any lights. Didn't talk. Just sat down in the living room, the weight of the last 2 days finally hitting all at once. Josh leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You think Devin's okay?" I shook my head. "Number." Josh exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Then finally, I asked, "What do you think happened out there?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking at me, he muttered, "I don't know, and I don't think I want to." That night, neither of us slept. Harvey lay curled up between us on the couch, his ears twitching at every sound. At one point, Josh muttered, "This is stupid," and got up to grab a beer from the fridge. The second he was gone, my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped. I grabbed it from my pocket, hands unsteady. A text from Chris. "Dude, Devin just texted me. He says he's going off the grid for a while. Says he doesn't want to talk to anyone. I stared at the screen. Then, before I could even process it, another text came in. From Devin. You guys need to forget about this. I read it twice. I wanted to reply, but I didn't know what to say. Forget about what? The trip? The man in the woods? The fact that whatever we saw, whatever followed us, was still out there. I turned off my phone and set it face down on the coffee table. Josh came back into the room, handing me a beer. He nodded at my phone. Who was that? I hesitated. Then I lied. Nobody. He didn't push. We sat there in silence, staring at the darkened television, pretending like we weren't both listening for something. The next morning, Devin was gone. His phone was off. His house was locked up. His car was still in the driveway, but he wasn't answering. Chris went over to check on him, but there was no sign of him. No note, nothing. It was like he had just left. We tried to call his family. They hadn't heard from him either. Days passed, then weeks. Nobody knew where he went. The police didn't consider him a missing person. They said he left on his own. But something about it felt wrong. Like it wasn't his choice. Like he knew something we didn't. And he was running from it. Or maybe it finally got him. I don't go hiking anymore. Josh doesn't either. Chris moved 2 states away. None of us ever talk about it. Not to each other. Not to anyone. We let it go. We pretend it never happened. But sometimes when I'm driving on an empty road, I get that same feeling again. Like there is something watching. Not close enough to see. Not close enough to hear. But still there. Still waiting. Still to this day, I have no idea what we saw or why it happened. Maybe it was just a drifter, a coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. But I will never go back to those woods. And I do not think Devin ever left. I got my dog Harvey 2 years ago when I moved into my current apartment. I live alone, and having him around makes me feel safer. He's not a guard dog or anything, just a mutt with scruffy fur and a goofy personality, but he's always been alert. He'll sit up and stare at the door before I even hear the mailman coming. He senses things before I do, which is why when he started barking at my bedroom closet, I didn't ignore it. At first, it was just an occasional thing. I'd be lying in bed, half asleep, when I'd hear him growling low in his throat. He'd be staring at the closet door, ears pinned back. I'd call his name, snap my fingers, and he'd stop hesitant, but eventually settling back down. I didn't think much of it at first. Dogs are weird sometimes. Maybe he heard something from my neighbors. Maybe he was just dreaming. But then it started happening every night. The first time I actually noticed the pattern, I had fallen asleep watching a movie in bed. The room was quiet, my phone was face down, and the only light came from the street lamps outside filtering through the curtains. Then Harvey let out a sharp bark. I jerked awake, my heart pounding. He was standing at the foot of my bed, his entire body stiff, his fur bristling. His eyes were locked on the closet door. "Harvey," I muttered, still groggy, "what's wrong?" He let out a low growl. I followed his gaze, feeling my stomach twist. The closet door was shut, same as always. Nothing was different. I sat up fully, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "It's just a closet, buddy," I murmured, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. He didn't move. Then I glanced at my phone. 3:02 a.m. A weird chill passed through me, but I shook it off. I got out of bed, crossed the room, and pulled open the closet door. It was empty. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "See? Nothing," I muttered, turning back toward Harvey. He was still watching. Even after I climbed back into bed, he stayed there for another 5 minutes, just staring. Then finally, he let out a low huff and curled up at my feet. I didn't sleep well after that. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was already awake. I had been scrolling mindlessly on my phone, trying to tire myself out, when Harvey suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked, eyes trained on the closet. I frowned. "Seriously?" Then he growled. It was a sound I had never heard from him before, deep, almost guttural. The hairs on my arms stood up. I swallowed, setting my phone aside. "Harvey, come here," I said quietly. He didn't move. My stomach tightened. I turned, staring at the closet myself now, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe a mouse got in. Maybe I left a window open somewhere and the air pressure shifted the door slightly. But the air was still. No wind, no movement. Just Harvey and me. And the closet. I turned on my bedside lamp, the warm light flooding the room. I forced myself to stand, heart pounding as I stepped toward the closet again. My fingers hovered over the handle for a second too long. Then I pulled it open. Nothing. Again. But Harvey still wouldn't stop staring. That night, I barely slept. By the third night, I was already on edge. It was a work night, and I was exhausted, but the second I crawled into bed, I felt a weight in my chest. Harvey was already standing, staring at the closet again. I glanced at my phone. 3 a.m. I gritted my teeth. I was so damn tired, too tired for this. I threw the blanket off and marched toward the closet door, my frustration overpowering my fear. "Look, Harvey," I muttered. "There's nothing in here." I yanked the door open. Empty. Of course. I turned back to him. "See?" He didn't move. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Maybe it's the smell of old laundry or something," I muttered. "I'll clean it out tomorrow." I shut the door and crawled back into bed, determined to ignore him this time. And for a few minutes, I actually started drifting off. Then I heard it. A soft, faint scratching. I went ice cold. My brain immediately scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a tree branch outside, but I lived on the 3rd floor. Maybe it was Harvey shifting in his sleep. I turned over and checked. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting up, ears pinned back, still watching the closet. I felt lightheaded. My breath came short and quick. Then I heard it again. Scratch, Scratch, scratch. From inside the closet, I bolted upright. Harvey let out a low, warning growl. I stared at the door, heart hammering. I felt like I was trapped in place, my body refusing to move. No way, no ein way, asterisk, asterisk. It was probably nothing. It had to be nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind that door. I clenched my jaw, forcing my legs to move. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped closer. Harvey followed behind me, low to the ground, muscles tense. I pressed my hand against the closet door. It felt ice cold. I counted to 3 in my head. Then I yanked it open. Nothing. No mouse, no draft, no reason for the sounds I had heard. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking. I was losing it. I had to be. I exhaled, forcing out a nervous chuckle. I need to stop watching horror movies, I muttered, shutting the door and stumbling back into bed. Harvey, however, stayed standing. Still watching. Still waiting. By the 4th night, I decided I needed proof. I set up my old baby monitor camera, the one I used when Harvey was a puppy. I positioned it to face the closet door, then crawled into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. I didn't even try to sleep. I just waited. And sure enough, at exactly 3 a.m., Harvey sat up. His ears perked, his body stiffened. I grabbed my phone and started recording the feed. Harvey let out a low growl. Then, on the screen, the closet door moved. Just a tiny bit. A slow, almost imperceptible shift. Like something had pressed against it from the inside. I felt my stomach drop. I checked the video again, my heart racing. No shadow, no movement. Nothing was there. But the door had moved. And as I looked back up, something else caught my eye. Harvey wasn't staring at the closet anymore. He was staring at me. Like he knew something I didn't. Like he was waiting to see what I would do next. I barely slept after that. I kept replaying the footage over and over, but it was always the same. The closet door moved, just slightly, just enough to make my stomach knot up with unease, but there was nothing visible behind it. No shadow, no flicker of movement, just air. Harvey wouldn't go near it. Even after I shut the door and crawled back into bed, he stayed planted at the edge of the room, facing the closet, his tail stiff and low. I called his name softly, but he didn't move. I didn't blame him. I didn't want to be near that door either. When the sun finally crept through the blinds, I got out of bed, my body aching with exhaustion. I moved toward the closet with caution, hesitating before pressing my palm against the wood. It felt like any other door. I took a slow breath and pulled it open. Empty. Of course. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and checked the security footage from the night before one last time, but nothing had changed. The door moved, but nothing was there. Harvey stood a few feet behind me, watching. His ears flicked slightly when I met his gaze. "You're making me paranoid," I muttered, rubbing my temples. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just weird dog behavior. Something was wrong. I spent the day cleaning, hoping to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation, a draft, a loose hinge, something simple. By noon, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. Then I found the scratches. I was picking up some shoes from the floor of the closet when I noticed them thin, jagged marks along the inside of the door. Some looked deep, others faint, like whatever made them had tried over and over again. A chill crept up my spine. I stared at them, my mind racing. Had these always been here? How had I never noticed them before? I crouched down, running my fingertips over the grooves. They were uneven, rough, almost frantic. Like something had been trying to get out. A shiver ran through me. I stood up quickly, brushing off my jeans. It was probably nothing. The scratches could have been there for years. Maybe a previous tenant had a pet, and it got trapped in here once. That made sense. That had to be it. Still, I shut the door a little harder than necessary. Harvey sat near the bed, staring. That night, I made sure the closet door was completely shut before getting into bed. I even wedged a chair in front of it, just in case. Harvey curled up next to me, resting his head against my leg. For the first time in days, he didn't immediately sit up and stare at the closet when the room went dark. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. The unease sat in my stomach, coiling tighter with every passing minute. I checked my phone, 2:58 a.m. I tried to ignore it. I squeezed my eyes shut, focused on my breathing, in, out, in, out. Then Harvey's head snapped up. My eyes flew open. He was staring at the closet again. His entire body stiffened. His breathing changed shallow, quick. I held my breath. Then, just as the clock struck 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock from inside the closet. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. Harvey let out a low growl, his ears pinned back. I gripped the blanket, my pulse racing so fast I felt lightheaded. The knock had been soft, almost careful, like someone testing the door. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, turned on the camera feed. I forced myself to watch. At 3:02 a.m., the closet door moved. It was so slow I almost missed it, just a tiny shift, like it had been nudged from the inside. Harvey growled again. I felt sick. I stared at the screen, waiting, watching. Nothing. No figure, no movement. The door had moved, but there was still nothing there. The scratching started at 3:04 a.m. Soft at first, then more insistent. Harvey barked loudly, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. The scratching stopped instantly. I couldn't breathe. I felt my body locking up, my instinct screaming at me to run. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. Harvey whined. I forced myself to breathe. I looked at my phone, 3:07 a.m. I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. The room flooded with warm light. Harvey slowly relaxed, tail lowering, but his eyes never left the closet. Neither did mine. I checked the time again, 3:10 a.m. Nothing happened. No more scratching. No more movement. By 3:15 a.m., Harvey finally curled back up, his body pressed against my side. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I decided I wasn't going to be alone tonight. I called my friend Katie and invited her over. I didn't tell her why I didn't want her thinking I was losing my mind. I just said I wanted company. She arrived with a bottle of wine, plopping onto the couch like she lived here. God, it's been forever. This place is cute. You always keep it so clean. I laughed, forcing myself to act normal. We talked, ate pizza, put on a movie. I kept telling myself that when 3 a.m. rolled around, I'd feel better with another person here. That was the plan. But at some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to Harvey barking. I jolted upright, my stomach dropping. The clock on the television read 3:01 a.m. Katie stirred on the other end of the couch, groggy. "What's going on?" Harvey was standing near the hallway, growling at my bedroom door. At the closet, Katie frowned, rubbing her eyes. "Why's he freaking out?" I couldn't answer. My body felt frozen. Then we both heard it. The unmistakable sound of something knocking twice from inside the closet. Katie shot me a look, her eyes wide with panic. "What the fuck was that? Asterisk, asterisk." I couldn't speak. Harvey kept growling, his body rigid. Katie slowly sat up, glancing between me and the hallway. "Are you messing with me? Please tell me this is some kind of prank." Then, before I could stop her, she stood up. She started walking toward my room. And I knew, deep in my gut, that if she opened that door, we weren't going to like what we found. I didn't stop Katie. I wanted to, I should have, but my body wouldn't move, like every part of me was screaming not to get involved. She reached for the closet door, hesitated for just a second, then yanked it open. The light from the hallway spilled in, casting long shadows on the walls. It was empty, just like before. The same coats, the same pair of old sneakers shoved in the corner, nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. For a second, I felt relief start to creep in. Maybe I really had been imagining things. Maybe the door moving, the scratching, Harvey's weird behavior, it could all be explained away. Katie let out a nervous chuckle, brushing a hand through her hair. "Dude, I think you need to sleep. This place is just..." She stopped. I saw her eyes flick downward. Her face went pale. A chill crawled up my spine. "What?" I whispered. She didn't answer, just stepped back, giving me room to see. I leaned in, my pulse hammering. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then my stomach dropped. There were scratches on the inside of the closet door. Long, jagged lines, like something had been dragging its nails down the wood. Some were fresh, the edges sharp and splintered. Others were older, faint but still visible, like whatever had made them had been trying for a long time. I stepped back, suddenly dizzy. Had those been there before? I would have noticed them. I would have. Katie cleared her throat. "That's weird." I swallowed hard, my hands clammy. "Yeah." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease creeping under my skin. Maybe someone who lived here before had a cat or something. I didn't believe it. And from the look on Katie's face, she didn't either. I shut the closet door hard and stepped away. Harvey let out a small whimper, but stayed close to my side. Katie forced a smile. "Let's just go back to the couch, yeah? Maybe put on a movie." I nodded, pretending like I could just brush this off. Like I could forget. We sat on the couch, watching something neither of us paid attention to. Every few minutes, my eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the closed closet door. Harvey stayed curled up next to me, but his ears were twitching, like he was still listening. By 2:45 a.m., Katie started to doze off, but I was wide awake. Waiting. Dreading. I glanced at my phone. 2:59 a.m. A cold sweat broke out along my skin. I held my breath. 3 a.m. Harvey's head shot up. A deep guttural growl rumbled from his chest. I turned toward the hallway, my stomach twisting into knots. The closet door was still shut. I forced myself to breathe. It was fine. Nothing was going to happen. Then, right as I exhaled, the door shifted. Not much, just an inch, just enough for the latch to release, with a soft click. I froze. Katie stirred next to me. "What's?" Then she saw the door. The color drained from her face. Neither of us moved. Harvey whimpered. Then, slowly, the door swung open a little more. I wanted to be rational. I wanted to tell myself it was just the air pressure, a draft, something explainable. But the air was still. The windows were closed. And something about the way the door moved, like it had been waiting for us to see it, made my blood run cold. Katie gripped my arm. "No fucking way." I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking. I pulled up the security camera feed from my bedroom, rewinding to just a few seconds ago. I pressed play. The screen showed the door opening on its own. Slow, deliberate, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no movement, no sign of anything that could have caused it. Just a door that shouldn't have moved. Katie's breath hitched. I don't like this." Neither did I. I got up, my legs shaky. I grabbed the chair from my desk and shoved it under the closet doorknob, pressing it tightly against the frame. Then I grabbed my keys. "Come on," I muttered. Katie didn't argue. Neither of us were staying here. We left that night. I didn't even pack a bag, I just drove. Katie stayed quiet the whole ride. So did I. What was there to say? We both saw it. We both knew something was wrong. I crashed at her place for the next few nights, avoiding my apartment, making excuses to myself, but deep down I knew I wasn't going back. Not to sleep. Not alone. I broke my lease the next week. My landlord didn't ask questions. Maybe he'd heard stories before. Maybe I wasn't the first. I moved to a new place, a different city. A fresh start. Harvey stopped growling at night. For a while, I let myself believe it was over. Then about a month later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photo. A picture of my old closet door. The scratches were deeper. There was a single new mark at the bottom, a long, jagged line, fresh, cutting through the paint. like something was still trying to get out. Still to this day, I have no idea what that was or why it happened. Maybe it was just the building settling. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe there was a logical explanation I'll never find. Or maybe I left something behind in that apartment. And maybe it's still there. I don't think I want to know.
I think my girlfriend killed someone in her sleep, and I have proof. I don't know how to start this. I guess I could say it began the night I first heard her sleep talking, but that's not really true. It started long before that. I just didn't realize it at the time. Her name is Emily, and she's perfect, or at least she was, the kind of woman you don't expect to walk into your life. Beautiful in a way that feels effortless, like she never had to try. She has this sharp, cutting wit that makes you feel like you have to keep up, like she's always 2 steps ahead. I met her at a coffee shop. It's cliché, I know, but it was one of those perfect movie moments. I was waiting for my order. She was balancing a book in one hand and a latte in the other. She nearly dropped both when I bumped into her. I apologized, offered to buy her another, and somehow, by the time we left, I had her number. It didn't take long before we were inseparable. She moved in after 6 months. It felt fast, but everything about Emily was intoxicating. You couldn't say no to her, not really. She had this way of making it seem like every decision was yours, even though, in hindsight, I think it was always hers. For a while, life was good. And then, the sleep-talking started. The first time it happened, I barely noticed. It was a little past 3 a.m. I was half awake, rolling over in bed when I heard it. A low murmur, barely more than a whisper. I thought she was talking to me at first. I mumbled something back, probably just, huh? But she didn't respond. Her breathing stayed slow, steady, asleep. I told myself it was nothing. But then it kept happening, not every night, but often enough that I started noticing. Sometimes it was soft and indistinct, just meaningless sounds. Other times, she would form actual words. I remember one night, about a month in, when I actually listened. I was lying there half asleep when her voice cut through the silence. Don't struggle. I felt my body tense. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone, calm, steady, like she wasn't dreaming at all. I turned my head toward her, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Her face was completely relaxed, lips slightly parted, her breath slow and even. She was asleep. I swallowed hard and rolled onto my back, staring at the ceiling. It's just nonsense, I told myself. Dreams don't mean anything. I ignored the nagging feeling in my gut and eventually drifted back to sleep. I shouldn't have ignored it, because that was the first real warning. The talking continued for weeks, but it was always scattered. Random phrases, things I couldn't piece together. Then, one night I woke up to her laughing. It was soft, barely a chuckle, but there was something wrong about it. I turned over, my heart already racing. Her eyes were shut, her body still, but then she whispered something that made my skin crawl. I buried him deep. I stopped breathing. I must have stiffened or moved, because suddenly she rolled toward me, still completely asleep. You won't find him. A chill ran down my spine. I sat up, swallowing hard, forcing myself to breathe. It was just sleep talking, I told myself. Just nonsense. But something felt different this time. This didn't sound like a dream, it sounded like a memory. I couldn't let it go after that. I started paying attention. I bought a sleep recorder app, one of those that only activates when it detects sound. I wanted to prove to myself that it was nothing. Instead, I made it worse, because what I recorded, I wish I had never heard it.
The next morning I sat in bed, staring at my phone. My chest was tight, fingers hovering over the screen. I had spent the night recording Emily's sleep, and I wasn't sure I actually wanted to listen. The app had flagged multiple clips, small timestamps, little moments where she spoke in the dark. I swallowed hard and pressed play. At first, it was the usual, soft murmurs,
indistinct words. But then, at around 2:47 a.m., her voice cut through the static. It was easy. I felt my body go rigid. The next clip auto-played. He stopped breathing fast. My fingers clenched the phone. Another recording. A long silence, then. They always do. I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the nightstand, screen still glowing. Emily stirred beside me, shifting under the covers. For the first time since I had met her, I felt afraid of her. This wasn't just sleep-talking. She wasn't mumbling about work stress or bad dreams. She was talking about a person who stopped breathing, a person she had buried. I sat there, heartbeat hammering in my skull, my entire body stiff with an anxiety I couldn't shake. I needed to know if it was just crazy dreams, or if I was sleeping next to something much worse. That's when I made my second mistake. I decided to look into her past. Emily never talked much about her life before we met. Whenever I asked about her childhood, she'd deflect, shift the conversation, steer it somewhere else. At the time, I thought it was just how she was. Now it felt like a red flag I'd been too blind to see. While she was at work, I sat at my desk, laptop open, trying to piece together who she really was. Social media, barely anything. A few old photos, accounts that hadn't been updated in years. School records? Sparse. She had moved around a lot, transferred from different colleges. Nothing set off alarms, until I searched for her name alongside missing person reports. That's when I found something. A news article. A man had disappeared a few years ago in a town just outside of where Emily used to live. A man who had briefly dated someone named Emily. His name was Mark Davidson, vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no evidence, just gone. And the last person to see him? Emily. A weight pressed against my chest. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together, my breath coming too fast. It was probably a coincidence. It had to be. Except, the night before, Emily had whispered something in her sleep. You won't find him. I shut the laptop. For the first time, I thought about leaving. Packing my things, making up an excuse, getting out before she came home. But I didn't. Because I needed proof. And that was my third mistake. That night, I set up another recording. Emily curled up beside me, completely unaware, breathing slow and steady. I forced myself to close my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I waited. Hours passed. The room was silent, except for the occasional creak of the apartment settling. Then, somewhere past 3 a.m., Emily shifted. Her breathing changed. And then, in the quiet, she spoke. You know, don't you? I felt my entire body lock up. She was asleep. I didn't move, didn't breathe. She rolled onto her back, eyes still shut, lips curling into something that almost looked like a smile. It's okay. A pause. Then, I was going to tell you soon. I felt sick. I lay there, stiff as stone, listening to her breathing even out again. She was still asleep, but I knew, right then and there, that I had to get out. I had to leave before she woke up. Because if she knew that I knew, I wouldn't get another chance. My entire body went numb. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against my skin like a weight. The only sound was the hum of the old heater and the thudding of my own pulse. Emily didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. I couldn't tell if she was waiting for me to speak or if she was waiting for me to run. She knew. She knew I had recorded her. And now, I had no idea what she was going to do. I forced myself to swallow. My throat felt tight, dry. Emily, I said, voice barely above a whisper, I just need some space, that's all. She smiled, but it wasn't real. It was careful, measured. I get that, she murmured. But why would you record me, Jason? I didn't answer. Because what the hell could I say? She took another step forward. I stepped back, bumping into the doorframe. The way she was looking at me now, it wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was understanding, like she had finally figured me out, and that terrified me. Emily sighed softly, glancing at the phone still glowing on the nightstand. Then, before I could react, she moved. Fast. I lunged for the phone, but she was quicker. Her fingers wrapped around it before I could reach it, and suddenly she was turning it over in her hands, scrolling through the recordings. I saw the moment she found it. Her lips parted just slightly. Her brows lifted in amusement. Then she looked back at me. "He stopped breathing fast." She read aloud. "Calm." My stomach churned. She played another clip. They always do. The room felt colder. Emily exhaled through her nose, her expression neutral. But her grip on the phone tightened. And then she laughed. Not loud, not fake. Just a quiet, genuine laugh. She lifted her gaze to mine. "You think I killed someone?" I couldn't speak. She tilted her head slightly. "That's why you've been so weird lately, isn't it?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. Emily took a slow step forward, and then she did something that made my blood turn to ice. She deleted the recording, right in front of me. A single swipe of her thumb. Gone. I lunged, but she pulled the phone back, raising an eyebrow. "Jason," she said softly, like she was scolding a child, "you're not being very smart about this." I clenched my fists. "You had no right." "No," she interrupted. "I have every right. You recorded me while I was asleep. You invaded my privacy." She tilted her head. "If anyone should be upset, it's me." My jaw clenched. "That's not..." She took another step forward. I took another step back. Her voice softened. "What exactly do you think I've done, Jason?" I swallowed. "I saw the news article." She blinked. For a split second, something flashed behind her eyes. Then she smiled. "Ah, Mark Davidson." The air shifted. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't laughing it off. I felt a sharp chill crawl down my spine. Emily took a slow breath, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said simply. I frowned. "What?" She pocketed my phone. "If you're so sure, let's go to the police." I felt my chest tighten. She shrugged. "You said you saw something, right? You think I killed him, so let's go." The room was spinning. Emily wasn't panicked. She wasn't scared. She was calling my bluff. And suddenly I realized she knows there's no proof. She had planned for this. Every part of me screamed to run, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I forced a breath. "Fine." Emily's smile widened. "Great." She grabbed her keys, and we left together. The car ride was silent. Emily drove like nothing was wrong, one hand resting lazily on the wheel, the other tapping against her knee. I sat stiff beside her, my mind racing. I had to be careful. One wrong move, one wrong word, and I wouldn't make it to the station. I watched the road signs. We were headed the right way. But then, after 20 minutes of driving, Emily took a turn away from town. My chest tightened. "Where are we going?" I asked. She hummed. "Shortcut." That was a lie. The trees thickened around us. The roads got narrower. And suddenly, I knew. She wasn't taking me to the police. She was taking me somewhere else. Somewhere no one would hear me. I had to get out, but before I could move, Emily slammed the brakes. My body lurched forward. The seatbelt locked tight across my chest. Before I could react, she turned toward me. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were dark. "Jason," she murmured. I swallowed hard. "What?" She tilted her head. "You should have stopped listening." A cold spike of fear shot through me. Then she smiled and locked the doors. The click of the lock sounded too final. My pulse jumped, a hot wave of panic spreading through my chest. I reached for the handle on instinct, but Emily's fingers wrapped around my wrist before I could touch it. Her grip wasn't tight. She wasn't hurting me, but I couldn't move. "Jason," she murmured, tilting her head. Where are you going? Her voice was gentle, like we were discussing something as simple as what to have for dinner. I forced myself to keep my breathing even. You said we were going to the police. Emily's expression remained unreadable. Then she laughed softly, shaking her head. You don't actually want that, do you? Her fingers loosened, but she didn't let go. You're scared. She studied me, her dark eyes searching mine, but not of me. I didn't speak. Her fingers slipped away, and she leaned back into her seat, exhaling as she drummed her nails lightly against the steering wheel. You're scared of being wrong. I swallowed, the car suddenly feeling too small, the air too still. You think you know something, she continued, voice smooth, but you don't. You have little pieces, sure, but that's all they are, pieces. She let the silence stretch. Then she turned her head toward me. So tell me, she said, her voice no longer soft, what exactly do you think I did? I hesitated. My stomach felt uneasy, a queasy rolling that wouldn't settle. Emily didn't blink. She was waiting. I had two options. I could lie, tell her I overreacted, that I didn't actually believe anything, that I just got spooked. Or I could say it, say what I really thought. I wet my lips, my throat dry as sandpaper. Mark Davidson. For the first time since I'd known her, Emily stilled completely. It was subtle, but she didn't move, didn't shift, didn't breathe. And in that moment, I knew. Her fingers flexed slightly against the wheel. Then, she sighed. I was really hoping you wouldn't say that. I exhaled, trying to steady my racing thoughts. So it's true. Emily's expression didn't change. She let out a slow breath, then unlocked the doors. I hesitated. You can go, she murmured. If you really think that, Jason, if you actually, genuinely believe I killed him, get out of the car. Walk away. A trap. That's what it felt like she was testing me. The car sat in the middle of nowhere, trees towering around us, the only light coming from the headlights, casting long shadows across the road. I could step outside. I could start running. But she would still be behind me, watching. I didn't move. Emily sighed again, shaking her head. See? She smiled. You don't really believe it? She was reeling me in, twisting things. I could feel it. I forced myself to exhale. My body coiled so tightly, I felt like I might snap. I need you to tell me the truth, I said quietly. Emily rolled her eyes. Jason, you've already made up your mind. I swallowed hard. She studied me again, and then she reached into her jacket pocket. My heartbeat spiked, but all she pulled out was a small folded photograph. She handed it to me. I hesitated. Then cautiously, I took it. I unfolded it, fingers trembling slightly, and my stomach twisted into a knot. It was a picture of me, sleeping. The blood drained from my face. I looked up, my throat tight. Emily was smiling. I told you, she murmured. You were never in danger. She tilted her head. Not until you started asking questions. My vision tunneled. The picture in my hands blurred. Jason? She said softly. I couldn't breathe. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. But you've always been such a good listener. Her fingers brushed mine. Tell me. She smiled. Are you listening now? The weight of the photo in my hands was unbearable. A picture of me, asleep, taken from inside my own home. I could barely keep my hands from shaking. My mouth felt dry, my pulse a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Emily was still watching me. Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, waiting, daring me to react. I had to be smart, careful. If I panicked now, I wouldn't get out of this. I forced myself to swallow, forcing the fear deep down, where she couldn't see it. Emily, I said, my voice strained. What is this? She laughed softly, like I had asked her something stupidly obvious. It's a photo, Jason. She tilted her head slightly, tapping her nails against the steering wheel. A reminder. I forced my fingers to unclench. My mind was racing, calculating my next move. If I lunged for the door, would I make it? If I ran, how far would I get? Emily sighed, stretching her arms before turning toward me again. You keep acting like this is some big mystery, Jason, like there's something to solve. She gestured toward the photo still clutched in my hand. But really, you already know the answer. I took a slow breath, forcing my expression to stay neutral. Don't let her see you unravel. Okay, I said carefully, and then tell me. She considered me for a moment. Then, I don't like when people leave. A cold prickle crawled up my arms. Emily smiled. You wouldn't leave, would you? I could feel the walls closing in. Every exit was already blocked. I had no proof, no recordings, no way to stop her. And I had the sinking feeling that she knew it. I needed to get out. I needed to leave now. But Emily could read me too well. She must have seen the decision settle in my bones. Because the second my fingers twitched toward the door handle, she moved. Her hand shot forward, wrapping around my wrist, tight this time. Not hurting, but firm. Enough to tell me that I wasn't going anywhere. Jason, she murmured, her fingers pressing against my pulse. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but I knew she could feel it, the erratic pounding beneath my skin. Emily sighed, tilting her head. I really hoped it wouldn't come to this. My chest tightened. She let out a breath, like she was debating something. Then she released me. I felt my shoulders tense, preparing to bolt. But then, she reached into her jacket again, and my body went completely still. I braced myself. For a knife, a gun, anything. But all she pulled out was a single, folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. Last chance, she said. I hesitated, then slowly unfolded it. My stomach turned. It was a list of names. Some I didn't recognize, but at the very bottom, Jason Carter, my own name. My head snapped up. Emily was watching me, calmly, patiently, like she was waiting to see what I'd do next. This isn't a threat, she murmured. My fingers tightened around the paper. She leaned in slightly. It's a promise. The air felt too thin. My thoughts were scrambling for a way out, and then Emily sighed. Say it, Jason, she murmured. My breath hitched. Say what? Her fingers brushed my wrist again, feather-light. Say you were wrong. My mind screamed at me to lie, to say anything she wanted to hear, but my body was frozen. Emily gave me a small, knowing smile, and then she reached toward the lock. Click. She unlocked the doors. She let me go. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and ran. I didn't stop running until I saw streetlights, until I saw cars, people, signs of life. I was shaking, breathless, my heart hammering so violently I thought I might collapse. But I didn't look back, not once, because I knew if I saw her watching me, I'd never stop running. I moved out of town the next day, changed my number, deleted social media, and for a while, nothing happened. Emily disappeared from my life as quickly as she had entered it. No calls, no messages, no signs she had ever existed at all. But I knew better. She was still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, my phone buzzes. Unknown number. No message, no voicemail, just silence. Like she's reminding me. I got away. For now. But the next time I see her name, it won't be a message. It'll be a list. And I don't know if I'll get a second chance to run.
I first saw the message while scrolling through my phone in bed, half asleep. Hey, is this you? It was from an old acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Attached was a link to a profile. At first I thought it was spam, Another one of those hacked accounts sending phishing links. I was about to ignore it when I noticed the profile picture. It was me. I hesitated, then clicked the link. The page loaded and my stomach dropped. The account looked exactly like mine. Same profile picture, same bio. Even the pinned post was word for word something I had posted months ago. But I had never made this account. I scrolled through the posts, my fingers suddenly clammy against the screen. It had been active for months. Newer picture-owns I had never taken showed up in the feed. Me at a coffee shop. Me walking to my office. Me wearing outfits I didn't recognize. I felt my pulse quicken. I clicked on the friends list, expecting it to be empty. It wasn't. This fake me had been talking to people. I scrolled through the messages, my stomach twisting. The conversations weren't normal. It's so hard to sleep lately. I keep waking up at 3:12 a.m. for no reason. I froze. I had been waking up at exactly 3:12 a.m. every night for the past week. I hadn't told anyone. I spent the next hour combing through the account. The more I looked, the worse it got. It wasn't just old posts being copied. It was details, personal things. This fake me knew my favorite coffee order, my work schedule, even the nickname my mom used to call me as a kid. The messages to other people were just off. Some started normal, small talk, then they would shift. Have you ever seen your reflection move when you weren't looking? Have you noticed the cameras on your phone don't blink at the same time? Does your shadow ever feel like it's one step behind you? I closed the app, my breath uneven. This wasn't just someone impersonating me. They were playing some kind of game. I went to report the account, but just as I was about to hit submit, my screen flashed with a new notification. A DM from my own fake account. Stop looking for me. I stared at my phone, every muscle in my body tense. Whoever was behind this, they knew I was watching. My hands shook as I typed a response. Who are you? The message was read instantly. 3 dots appeared, typing. Then, you should know, you're me. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I didn't respond. Instead, I went straight to the app settings and reported the account. It had to be taken down. Whoever was doing this, whoever was pretending to be me, they couldn't keep using my face. I shut off my phone and sat there in the dark, my heart still racing. For a long time, nothing happened. No messages, no notifications. I started to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was just paranoid. Then my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before looking. Another DM. This time, just an image. A blurry photo. I clicked on it and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a picture of my apartment building, taken from the street. Tonight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, staring at my phone screen. The image burned into my mind. It was my apartment building. The picture had been taken tonight. I checked the timestamp, 2:54 a.m., less than 20 minutes ago. Whoever was running that account, they had been outside my home. I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was some kind of internet prank. But that didn't explain the details. They knew too much. They knew about 3:12 a.m. They knew my daily routines. They knew where I lived. And now they knew I was scared. The next morning, I reported the account again. I flagged every post, every message. I even contacted customer support, explaining that someone was impersonating me and harassing me online. The response was frustratingly generic. Thank you for your report. We will review this profile and take action if it violates our guidelines. I refreshed the page obsessively for hours, waiting for the account to disappear. It didn't. I tried to distract myself with work, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to that photo. Had they just taken a picture, or had they been watching me? I told myself I was being paranoid, that nothing had actually happened yet. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed again. A new DM from my fake account. I told you to stop looking. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The room was too quiet. Then another message appeared. Why aren't you asleep? I felt my pulse hammering. They were watching. They had been watching this whole time. I turned off my lights, shut my curtains, locked my bedroom door. My body felt like it was running on pure adrenaline, my fingers trembling as I typed a response. Leave me alone. I'm reporting this to the police. The 3 dots appeared, typing. Then another picture. I felt cold all over. It was my bedroom window. Taken from outside. I called the police. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely press the buttons. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm, routine. 911. What's your emergency? There's someone outside my apartment, I said, my voice shaking. I gave her my address, told her about the photo, the fake account, the stalking. Stay inside, keep your doors locked. Officers are on the way, she said. I stood in my dark room, my back pressed against the wall, listening. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no movement. Just the faint hum of my phone vibrating in my hand, the screen lighting up with a new notification. Another message from the fake account. You called the cops. That wasn't very smart. My breath hitched. I turned my phone off and stood there in the dark, counting the seconds until I heard the sound of police sirens. The officers arrived 10 minutes later. They checked the area, searched the parking lot, even walked around the building. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no suspicious cars. One of them, Officer Reynolds, asked me to show him the account. I hesitated before unlocking my phone, my stomach twisting. I opened the app and froze. The account was gone, completely wiped. No username, no messages, nothing. Like it had never existed. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his forehead. You said this has been happening for how long? Since yesterday, I said weakly. I swear the account was here. It was messaging me. It sent me pictures from outside. He nodded, but I could tell he was skeptical. This could be a prank. A burner account someone made to mess with you, he said. Since they deleted it, There's not much we can do unless they make contact again. I felt frustration boiling in my chest. They were outside my window. "We'll file a report," he assured me. "If anything else happens, call us immediately." I nodded, but it didn't make me feel any safer. They left, and I was alone again. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening. For footsteps, for breathing, for anything. The night dragged on, every shadow in my apartment stretching too long, every creak of the building making my skin crawl. But nothing happened. No knocks at the door. No new messages. By morning, I started to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe whoever had been tormenting me got scared when I called the cops. Maybe they were done. Then, at 7:46 a.m., I got a notification. A new account had followed me. The username was almost identical to the last one, just with a slight variation. And they had already posted something. I felt my hands go numb as I clicked on it. A photo. My bedroom. Taken from inside my apartment. While I was asleep, I don't remember grabbing my bag or my keys. I don't remember locking the door behind me. I just remember running. My legs felt numb. My breath came in sharp bursts, but I didn't stop. I made it down the stairwell of my apartment complex, out into the open air, the morning light feeling too harsh, too unreal. I wasn't safe in there. Whoever was behind this hadn't just been watching me. They had been inside. I called the police again from my car, my fingers trembling so badly that I could barely hold the phone. The dispatcher sounded the same as before, calm, detached, routine. "I need help," I gasped. "Someone broke into my apartment. They took a picture of me while I was sleeping. I just saw it online. I don't know how they got in." "Are you in a safe location?" "I think so." "Stay there. Officers are on the way." I hung up and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My front door had been locked this morning. There were no broken windows, no signs of a break-in, which meant they never left. The police arrived in less than 10 minutes. This time, they took me seriously. 2 officers, Reynolds and Carter, checked my apartment. They went room by room, searching for any sign of forced entry, for anything missing. They found nothing. The locks were intact. The windows were still latched. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there except me. But someone had been there. Reynolds looked uneasy as he flipped through his notepad. "You said the photo was posted this morning?" I nodded. "And the account? It's gone?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, just like last time." Carter glanced at the security camera above my apartment door. "Does your building have surveillance footage?" I exhaled sharply. Why hadn't I thought of that? "Yes," I said. "The property manager has access." Reynolds nodded. "We'll get the footage. In the meantime, we suggest staying somewhere else for the night." I didn't argue. I wasn't stepping foot back in that apartment until I knew who had been inside. I stayed at a hotel that night, the kind with 2 bright hallways and generic artwork on the walls. The second I locked the door behind me, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. No new messages, no new accounts. no notifications. But I knew it wasn't over. It didn't feel over. The silence felt worse than the messages. I left the bedside lamp on as I lay down, my body stiff with exhaustion. I was too wired to sleep, but at some point my mind shut down, and I drifted off into a restless half-dream. Then my phone buzzed. I woke up instantly, my heart pounding. 3:12 a.m. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking. There was a new notification, a message. Not from an unknown number. Not from a fake account. From my own phone. I felt sick as I opened it. It was a picture. Not of my apartment. Not of my car. Not of the hotel room I was in right now. It was an old photo of me. From years ago. I recognized it instantly. It was from my 18th birthday. A group picture, me in the center, laughing. But as I stared at the image, my stomach twisted. Someone had been edited into it. A figure stood in the background, blurred slightly, as if they had always been there. A man. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing. His face was too pale, too stretched, his eyes too empty. Like a badly photoshopped ghost. But this wasn't just a random edit. The original picture had been taken on a disposable camera. There was no digital version. I never uploaded it. I never scanned it. I never posted it anywhere. So how the hell did they have it? I didn't sleep. I sat there in the dim light of the hotel room, my pulse pounding in my ears, the phone clutched in my trembling hands. I had thought this was just stalking. I had thought someone had hacked my accounts, stolen my pictures, followed me online. But this was something else. They had been watching me for longer than I realized. Maybe even before I ever noticed. The police called me the next afternoon. Reynolds' voice was tense. We got the security footage. I straightened, gripping the edge of the hotel desk, and a pause. Then, you need to come down to the station. The footage wasn't what I expected. It didn't show someone breaking into my apartment. It didn't show a masked figure sneaking inside. What it showed was me. At 2:43 a.m., I left my apartment. Alone. I walked down the hall, out of the building, into the parking lot. I stood there for almost 20 minutes. Then I turned around, went back inside, and locked the door behind me. I watched the footage in horrified silence. I had no memory of this. I never left my apartment. I was asleep. I felt cold all over. Reynolds exhaled, rubbing his temples. Are you on any medication? Sleepwalking history? I shook my head, my hands gripping the chair. Number nothing. Carter leaned forward. This isn't just about someone online. This isn't just an impersonation. Someone. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Someone has been inside your life for longer than you think. I swallowed hard. What do I do? The officers exchanged a look. Then Reynolds sighed. You disappear. I don't use social media anymore. I don't post pictures. I don't keep accounts. I wiped everything, moved to another city, changed my number. But it still doesn't feel like enough. Because sometimes when I'm walking alone, I swear I feel eyes on me. Sometimes I wake up at 3:12 a.m., drenched in sweat, my heart racing, with the feeling that I just came back from somewhere. And sometimes, when I check my phone, I see a notification from an account that doesn't exist. A single message. "You can't run forever. I'll find you again soon." And attached, another picture of me, from a moment I don't remember.
Photography has never been more than a hobby for me. Some people paint, others play instruments. I take pictures. I like capturing moments that feel empty, frozen in time. Abandoned streets at dawn, forgotten alleyways, train stations just before the last departure of the night. There's something about the stillness that's always pulled me in, like I'm documenting places the world has left behind. I never took pictures of people, not intentionally anyway. I liked my photos to feel untouched, undisturbed, free of human interference. That's why, when I first noticed the man in one of my shots, I barely paid him any mind. It was a picture I had taken near the riverfront, an old cobblestone walkway lined with rusted lampposts. The sky had been a deep shade of navy, the last remnants of daylight barely clinging to the horizon. I had been focused on getting the symmetry right, the way the lampposts cast long, thin shadows stretching toward the water. It wasn't until later, when I was going through my shots, that I noticed the figure standing in the distance. He was near the edge of the frame, half hidden in the gloom beneath a flickering streetlight. A tall man, wearing a hood, his face completely obscured by shadow. His posture was off, rigid, almost unnatural, like he wasn't just passing through but standing there deliberately, watching. I remember staring at the image for a long time, feeling vaguely unsettled but ultimately brushing it off. People ended up in my photos all the time. That's just how it was in a city. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I saw him again. I had spent the day walking through different neighborhoods looking for new angles, fresh places to shoot. That night, as I uploaded the day's shots onto my laptop, something stopped me cold. There he was. Different street, different time of day, same hooded figure standing just out of focus, lingering at the edge of the frame. I felt my stomach tighten. I flipped through the images again, searching, my fingers moving faster. I found another, then another. Every few shoots, there he was. I started combing through my older photos. He was there too. Not always obvious, not always in plain sight, but once I started looking, I couldn't unsee it. Sometimes he was in the background, blending into the crowd. Other times he was more isolated, standing near an alleyway, leaning against a railing, positioned behind a tree just far enough that only half his body was visible. The strangest part, the timeline didn't make sense. The first time I noticed him was weeks ago, but as I dug deeper, I found him in shots from months ago, different seasons, different locations. He had been following me for much longer than I had realized. That night, sleep was out of the question. I sat in my apartment, laptop open, heart pounding as I clicked through years of photos. The earliest one I found was from nearly 2 years ago. I had no explanation. Had he been tracking me all this time? Had I really been that oblivious? I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an odd angle making random passers-by look familiar. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. He was there on purpose. I stopped taking photos for a while. For weeks, my camera collected dust on my desk. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning crowds, checking reflections in windows. But paranoia settled into my bones like an illness. Then, one night, I made a mistake. I went shooting again. I told myself I just needed closure. One last night of photos to prove to myself that he wasn't really there, that my paranoia had gotten the better of me. I stuck to busy streets, well-lit areas, places with cameras and people. I avoided isolated alleyways, stayed away from quiet corners where shadows stretched too far, and for a while, it felt normal. But when I got home and plugged in my camera, there was a photo I didn't take. My breath stalled in my chest. It was blurry, poorly framed, like the lens had been lifted and clicked at random, but the subject was unmistakable. It was me. Not a reflection, not a shadow. A photo taken from behind me, somewhere in the crowd while I had been taking pictures. Someone had been standing inches away from me, and I hadn't even known. Panic spread through me in icy waves. I scanned the photo for details, desperate for any clue, the angle, the location. It had been taken no more than an hour before I got home. Whoever took it had been close enough to reach out and touch me. I called the police that night. I told them everything, the photos, the stranger, the realization that he had been following me for years. An officer came by, took a statement, assured me they would look into it. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't take it seriously. No real crime had been committed. No threats, no evidence beyond my own paranoia. I installed extra locks, kept my curtains shut tight, stopped going out at night, and for a few weeks, nothing happened. Then the envelope arrived. It was slipped under my apartment door while I was sleeping. No return address, no markings, just a plain white envelope containing a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from inside my own apartment. I ran straight to the police station, envelope clutched in my shaking hands. This time they listened. Officers arrived at my apartment within minutes. They checked the locks, dusted for prints, reviewed security footage. And this time they found something. The cameras in my building had caught him. A man in a dark hoodie, waiting outside the entrance at 2:46 a.m. He never entered through the front. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, but in one frame he could be seen slipping into the stairwell behind a tenant, walking straight toward my floor. They arrested him a week later. He had been watching me for over 3 years. He lived just a few blocks away, a man I had never met, never spoken to, never noticed in my daily life. But he had noticed me. The police found hundreds of photos in his apartment. Shots of me walking home, sitting in cafes, standing at crosswalks, flipping through books in stores. Some from months ago, some from years ago, and some from inside my apartment while I was sleeping. They asked if I wanted to see them. I said no. I haven't picked up my camera since. Because I know I wasn't the first person he watched, and I won't be the last. I used to work the late shift at Domino's, delivering pizzas until 2, sometimes 3 in the morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and most nights were uneventful. Drunk college kids, night shift workers, the occasional stoner who forgot they even ordered. It was all pretty routine. Then there was that night. It started like any other, the usual slow trickle of late-night orders, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 1:45 a.m., just as I was thinking about cleaning up and heading home, a last-minute order came in. 1 large pepperoni, paid in cash. The address wasn't far, somewhere on the outskirts of town, near a wooded area where houses were more spread out. I groaned, not thrilled about the idea of driving down an empty road that late, but a tip is a tip. I grabbed the box, hopped in my car, and punched the address into Google Maps. The route took me further away from civilization than I expected. Streetlights became sparse, and the houses were spaced farther apart, swallowed by darkness. I turned onto a narrow, cracked road lined with twisted, overgrown trees, their branches casting jagged shadows under my headlights. The GPS led me to a small, isolated house at the very end of the road. No lights were on. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching against loose gravel. The house looked abandoned. Paint peeling off the siding, a broken porch railing, weeds growing in tangled patches around the steps. I checked the ticket again. Yep, this was the address. I hesitated. Most people waiting for a pizza leave some kind of light on. A porch light, a living room lamp. Something. But this place was pitch black. I grabbed the pizza, stepped out of the car, and made my way up the creaking steps. I knocked twice, the sound too loud in the silence. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I sighed, already picturing some wasted guy passed out on the couch, forgetting he ordered. I reached for my phone to call the number on the receipt when I noticed something. The front door was slightly open. Not a lot, just a crack, barely enough to see into the house. But it had been closed when I got here, I was sure of it. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I should have left. I should have just turned around, gone back to my car, and driven away. But something about the whole situation made me uneasy. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. Darkness. Empty space. A hallway leading deeper into the house. The air smelled stale, like old wood and something slightly sour. No movement, no voices. Then, from somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked. I froze. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Another creak, closer this time. Then, in the dimness of the hallway, a shape moved. I didn't see details, just the faintest shift in the darkness, something tall, lurking just out of view. And then, a voice. "Come inside." Soft, hoarse, Ron. I dropped the pizza. My body finally obeyed and I turned, bolting down the steps so fast I nearly tripped. My heart hammered as I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling to start the car. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the porch. The door was wide open now. I could see further inside, see more of the hallway, more of the darkness. And standing just beyond the threshold was a man, or at least something shaped like a man. He was too tall, his limbs too long, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He stood there, completely still, just watching me. My hands shook as I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel. As I backed away, the figure stepped forward. One slow, deliberate movement, like he was testing the air. I slammed the gas, peeling away down the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the Domino's parking lot, still shaking as I stumbled inside. My manager took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him everything. The empty house, the open door, the voice. He frowned, grabbing the store phone to call the number on the receipt. Disconnected. Then he checked the address. It didn't exist. The road, the house, nothing was there. The order had never been placed. There was no record of it in the system. I quit that night. I don't deliver anymore. But sometimes, when I'm out late, driving past dark, empty houses, I swear I see a door just slightly open, and a figure standing just beyond it, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every shadow in my room feeling too deep, too dark. My brain replayed the night over and over. The empty house, the door that had been closed, then cracked, then wide open. The voice that didn't sound quite right, and the figure, too tall, too still, watching me. But what bothered me the most wasn't the house, the order, or even the way the address didn't exist. It was the way he moved. Or rather, the way he barely moved at all. The step forward had been slow, measured, like he was waiting for something, like he knew I was watching. I tried telling myself it was a prank, some elaborate trick. But the address wasn't real, the number was disconnected, and I knew, deep in my gut, that I hadn't been meant to leave. The next day I drove back to where the house had been, or where I thought it had been. The cracked road was still there, lined with its twisting trees and jagged shadows, but at the end of the road, where the house had stood, there was nothing. No foundation, no debris, just an overgrown clearing, the weeds waist-high, swaying slightly in the wind, like no house had ever been there. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Had I somehow gone to the wrong place? But I knew that wasn't true. I had parked in this exact spot. I had seen the porch, the peeling paint, the broken railing. I had seen him. A sudden, awful thought slithered into my mind. What if he's still here? I didn't stick around to find out. I left, drove straight home, locked the doors. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, I woke up to a knock at my door. It was 1:45 a.m., the exact time I had delivered that order. I sat up, heart pounding. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. No one came to my door this late. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I checked the peephole. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway, empty as ever. I stood there, listening, barely breathing. A full minute passed, then another. I exhaled shakily, backing away. I told myself it was nothing, just some drunk neighbor knocking on the wrong door. I turned to go back to bed. No, I froze. It was closer this time. Not at the door. At my bedroom window. I spun around, my stomach twisting violently. My apartment was 3 floors up. There was no balcony, no fire escape. There was no way anyone could be outside my window. But I heard it. And then the handle on my front door rattled. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, and backed into the corner of the room, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The doorknob twisted slowly, testing. And then silence. No more knocking, no more rattling, just nothing. For hours I sat there, frozen in fear, waiting for it to come back. I didn't sleep, I didn't move. And when the sun finally rose, spilling weak morning light into my apartment, I finally worked up the courage to check the door. It was still locked, bolted, but something was waiting for me. A single piece of paper had been slipped under the door. I picked it up with numb fingers, unfolding it slowly. There were only 5 words, written in thin, careful letters. I found you this time. I threw up. I called the police, barely able to get the words out. They arrived within minutes, checking the building, searching for any sign of an intruder. They didn't find anything. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving my floor. There was no one in the hall, no one outside my window. They treated me like I was imagining things. I wasn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat up in bed, lights on, every sound making my pulse spike. I checked the door every hour. I checked the windows. Nothing. For 3 nights, nothing happened. No knocks, no notes, no rattling doorknob. And then, the 4th night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. A text message from an unknown number. I hesitated, then opened it. A photo, a picture of me, asleep in my bed, taken from inside my apartment. I ran. I didn't grab anything. I just grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and bolted down the hallway. I drove straight to my friend's place across town and stayed there for a week. When I finally went back to my apartment, it felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was still lurking there, waiting for me to come back. But nothing happened. No more texts, no more knocks, nothing. Until last night. I had almost convinced myself it was over, that maybe somehow I had gotten away. Then, just as I was getting into bed, my phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. It was an address. I copied it into Google Maps, heart pounding. It was a police station. My stomach twisted. What the hell was this? Then another text came through. Check the news. I hesitated, then opened my laptop, my hands shaking as I typed. The first headline stopped my heart. Breaking. Man arrested after breaking into apartment. Stalked victim for months. I clicked the article, my vision blurring as I read. The man was caught breaking into someone else's apartment last night. A neighbor had called the cops after hearing strange noises. When they arrested him, he had a knife, a lock-picking kit, and dozens of photographs. Pictures of me, taken over the past year. My blood turned to ice. Another text came through. A single message. I wasn't working alone. I stared at the screen, my pulse a roaring drum in my ears. I typed back, my hands slick with sweat. Who is this? No response. And then, a knock at my door. I didn't move. The knock at my door wasn't loud. It was soft, deliberate. The kind of knock someone does when they know you're home, when they're waiting. I gripped my phone tightly, my fingers slick with sweat, my mind racing. Whoever had been texting me knew things. Whoever had broken into my apartment had been caught. But if he had a partner, someone still out there, who the hell was at my door now? I forced myself to my feet, heart pounding as I stepped toward the peephole. My breath stalled. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Then my phone buzzed again. Another text. Check the camera feed. I hesitated, then slowly opened the security app on my phone. My apartment building had security cameras. One pointed at each hallway, another at the front entrance. I tapped into the hallway feed, and there he was, standing just out of frame. Not in front of my door, just to the side, in the blind spot of the peephole. Waiting? A jagged chill crawled up my spine. I watched as he stood there, motionless, his head tilted slightly toward my door. He knew. He knew I was watching. Then, the sound of police sirens. Faint at first, growing louder. My phone buzzed again. Don't open the door. I didn't. I stepped back, my pulse hammering as I listened to the sirens pull up outside the building. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs. Someone yelled commands. A door slammed open. Then, struggling, shouting. I checked the feed again, my stomach tightening. The man outside my apartment had turned. He was running, but he didn't make it far. 2 officers tackled him to the ground. More shouts, someone yelling, "We got him!" And then, just like that, it was over. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with adrenaline. The next hour was a blur. Cops at my door, questions, reports. They showed me his mugshot. A man in his 40s, hollow eyes, a sick, twisted grin. He had been watching me for months, maybe longer. But that wasn't the worst part. I asked about the first guy, the one they caught breaking into the other apartment. One of the officers shook his head. "We found his body this morning." My blood ran cold. "What?" I whispered. "Dead. Stabbed over a dozen times. Whoever did it, they wanted him gone." I stared at him, my breath coming short. If the first guy was dead, then who the hell had been texting me? Who had warned me? I never found out. The texts stopped. The unknown number was disconnected. The police called it a coincidence. I call it something else. I moved out of state after that. New city, new job, new apartment. Somewhere with no windows facing the street, somewhere where no one knows me. But I still check my phone at night. I still glance at security cameras before opening my door. Because someone out there warned me. Someone out there was watching him too. And I can't help but wonder, what happens when they start watching me again? I used to see him nearly every morning, always standing near the corner of Foster and 8th, where the city met the quieter, more residential streets. He never begged, never moved, just stood there in the same worn-out gray coat, hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing against a cold only he could feel. At first I didn't pay him much mind. It's a city, people exist in their own worlds. But after a few weeks, I started to notice him. His face was lean, hollow, like someone who had either given up or been worn down by something much larger than himself. His dark eyes didn't dart around like most people in his situation. They stayed locked on one point: the entrance to my office building. I tried not to dwell on it. I'd remind myself that cities were full of forgotten people, those who had simply slipped through the cracks of life. It wasn't my place to judge or interfere. But that didn't explain the feeling. The one that started creeping in after a month or so. The sense that he wasn't just standing there, that he was waiting. I was never the kind of person to fixate on things. I had my routine, my job, my small, predictable life, and I liked it that way. I wasn't the guy who noticed strangers, or who let his mind wander into places it didn't belong. Maybe that's why it took me so long to put the pieces together. Or maybe I just didn't want to. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where nothing ever really changed. My father was a quiet man, an observer. He wasn't warm, not in the way my mother was. He didn't fill the house with laughter or soft reassurances, but he was constant, reliable in his own way. He worked hard, but never spoke much about his job. As a kid, I thought nothing of it. Parents go to work, they come home. That was life. My mother was the opposite of him, vibrant, full of life, someone who left a room feeling lighter than when she'd entered it. She balanced him out. For the most part, we were normal. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Until we weren't. Until the day he left. I was 17, old enough to understand that something was wrong, but not old enough to know how to fix it. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no long, painful speeches about broken love or resentment. One day he just left, walked out the door, and never came back. The police took the report. They asked the questions. My mother cried, then grew quiet, then stopped speaking about him entirely. It was as if, overnight, he had simply been erased from our lives. And maybe that was easier. Maybe it was better than the not knowing. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I always knew it was a lie. Because you don't just disappear. Not without reason. Not without leaving something behind. I hadn't thought about him in years. Not until that morning, when I finally looked closer at the man on the corner. The moment I saw the jacket, I felt my stomach tighten. At first, I didn't understand why. It was just an old coat, nothing remarkable. Faded, tattered at the cuffs, the color worn from time. And then it clicked. I'd seen that jacket before. Not just somewhere. On someone. My father. He'd had a gray wool coat exactly like it. The same cut, the same worn fabric, the same small tear near the left sleeve. The same missing top button. My head felt light. I blinked, gripping the strap of my bag as if it could tether me to the ground. It wasn't possible. It had been 10 years. And yet there it was, the jacket. My father's jacket, worn by a man I had never met. That day, instead of walking past him, I stopped. Up close, the details were even clearer. The jacket wasn't just similar, it was the same one. I could see the faint stain near the collar, the exact way the fabric had creased over years of wear. My throat was dry, my pulse hammered in my ears. "Where did you get that coat?" I asked. The man's expression didn't change. For a long moment, he just watched me. Then, slowly, he reached up, fingers brushing over the patch on the sleeve. His voice, when it came, was quiet. It was given to me. A chill ran through me. "By who?" He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering whether to answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "By a man who lost everything." My blood ran cold. I felt the air shift around me, the city noise fading into the background. I stepped closer. "Who was he?" A pause. Then he spoke. Low, careful. "You already know." A memory surfaced. A conversation I hadn't thought about in years. I was 15. Sitting across from my father at the kitchen table. It had been one of those rare moments where he spoke about himself. About his past. "Some people don't just disappear," he had said. His voice was quiet, like he was talking to himself more than to me. I had frowned. "What do you mean?" He had sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Sometimes they're made to disappear." It hadn't made sense to me then, but standing there, looking into the stranger's eyes, I understood. I wasn't just talking to some homeless man. I was talking to a ghost of my father's past. Someone who knew what happened to him. Someone who knew why he left. I took a step back. "Tell me the truth. Who are you?" The man exhaled, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Something that shattered everything I thought I knew. "I'm the reason he ran." I felt my body go cold. The noise of the city faded. The distant honks, the low hum of passing voices, the shuffle of footsteps on the pavement. All of it drowned beneath the weight of his words. "I'm the reason he ran." My throat tightened. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The rational part of me, the part that functioned in meetings, that paid bills, that dismissed paranoia, wanted to scoff, to shake my head, step back, and walk away. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. The way he said it wasn't dramatic. There was no smugness, no theatrics, just a quiet, matter-of-fact statement. I took a slow breath, forcing my voice to stay even. What? The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether I deserved an answer. Then, finally, and knew something he wasn't supposed to. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I wanted to press him for more. What did he know? Why did he leave? Where is he now? But I could barely keep my mind straight. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something deep, something dark, something I wasn't meant to look into. The man must have seen the shift in my expression because his gaze softened. "You shouldn't go looking for him," he said. "Some people disappear for a reason." I stared at him, my pulse thudding against my temples. And then, before I could say another word, he turned and walked away. It happened so fast, so casually, as if our entire conversation had never happened. He melted into the stream of pedestrians, his form swallowed by the morning crowd. I could have followed him. I almost did, but something in my gut, something primal, told me not to. I stood there for a long time, my breath uneven, my hands ice cold despite the warmth of the sun. Then, finally, I turned and went inside my office. I barely got through work that day. My mind wouldn't stop circling the same thoughts, the same possibilities. Was my father alive? Was he in hiding? And from who? I thought about calling my mother, but what would I even say? "Hey, remember Dad? Yeah, I think I just met a guy who knows what happened to him." She had worked so hard to move on, to push his disappearance into the past. Digging it back up after all these years felt wrong, but doing nothing felt worse. So, that night I did what any restless, paranoid person would do. I started searching. I didn't have much to go on, but I had my father's old records. Some paperwork my mother never threw away. A work history, old bank statements, a few contacts he had listed for emergencies. I started making calls. Most of them went nowhere, disconnected numbers, dead ends. But one answered. It was an old friend of his, a guy named Carl Whitmore. I barely remembered him, just a vague recollection of a man who used to come over for dinner a few times when I was a kid. The second I said my name, there was silence. Then, in a hushed voice, Carl asked, "Why are you calling me about your father?" My stomach clenched. "Because I need to know what happened to him." Another pause. Then, quieter, "Has someone been watching you?" The question sent a spike of adrenaline through me. Had someone been watching me? The man on the street? Was that what he had been doing all along? I swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. "I don't know." Carl exhaled sharply. "Listen to me. Let it go. Whatever you think you want to know, it's not worth it. Your father knew that. That's why he left." "Left to go where?" "I don't know," Carl said. "And if I did, I wouldn't tell you." "Carl, forget this number." Click. The call ended. I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at my phone. I should have been frustrated, angry, but mostly I felt uneasy. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the tone. Carl had sounded afraid, genuinely afraid. And that terrified me. Because if he was scared, if my father had been scared, then what the hell had he gotten involved in? And more importantly, was it coming for me now? I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to figure out what to do next. I wanted to keep searching, but something inside me, something instinctual, was telling me to stop, to listen to Carl, to let it go. And maybe I would have. Maybe I would have shut the door on the past and moved on with my life. But the next morning, when I stepped outside for work, I felt it. That sinking feeling. Like I was being watched. I turned my head slowly, scanning the street. Pedestrians walked by, cars crawled through traffic, nothing out of the ordinary. And then, there, across the street, the man was back. Same tattered jacket, same hollow stare. But this time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking toward me. I didn't go to work that day. I turned around, locked my apartment door, and sat with my back against it, heart pounding, breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he wanted. But I knew one thing. He wasn't just some homeless man. And whatever my father had run from, it had finally found me. I stayed in my apartment for the rest of the day. I didn't turn on the lights. I barely moved. Every time I so much as breathed, I felt like someone was listening. I sat by the peephole for hours, watching the hallway, waiting for a shadow to move across the door. I didn't know what I was expecting. Someone knocking? A voice calling my name? The sound of a key slipping into the lock. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion got the best of me. I crashed on the couch, my mind replaying every single moment of the last few days. The man on the street, the jacket, the phone call, and that one sentence that refused to leave my head. I'm the reason he ran. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was dark. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, too thick, too heavy. And then, a noise, soft, subtle, coming from outside my door. I held my breath. It wasn't knocking, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow, measured. Someone standing just outside, listening, waiting. I stayed completely still, my fingers gripping the couch. My pulse thudded against my skull. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then, a piece of paper slid under the door. I stared at it, my whole body locking up. My apartment had no windows facing the hallway. I had no way of seeing who was out there. Seconds passed, then minutes. I didn't move until I heard the faintest sound of footsteps retreating. Slow, steady, like whoever had been there wanted me to know they weren't in a rush. Finally, when the silence stretched long enough that my ears rang from the pressure, I crawled forward. The note was folded, crisp, almost too clean for something delivered like this. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, there was only one line, written in my father's handwriting. Stop looking. I don't remember the next few minutes. Maybe I sat there, maybe I whispered something under my breath, maybe I closed my eyes and pretended I was dreaming. But deep down, I knew this was real. I knew my father was alive. And more than that, I knew he was watching. I should have been relieved. I should have felt some kind of closure, some kind of answer after all these years. But I didn't. Because if he was alive, that meant he had never left. He had just been hiding from them, from the man on the street. And now, because I had been stupid enough to start digging, they knew where I was, too. That night, I packed a bag. I called my boss, told him I was taking a leave of absence. I didn't say why. Then, I turned off my phone, threw it in the trash, and left my apartment. Not just for the night, not just for a while, for good. Because whatever my father had been running from, whatever shadow had been looming over his life for the past 10 years, it had finally caught up to me, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out why. I sat there on the floor for what felt like an eternity, the note still clenched in my fingers, the weight of it pressed into my chest, heavy, suffocating. Stop looking. Not a warning, a command. I knew then, without a doubt, that my father was alive. But he wasn't trying to find me. He wasn't coming back. He was keeping me away, and that meant only one thing. Whatever he ran from, he was still running. And now, because I had gone looking, I had put myself in the same danger. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky, my body humming with adrenaline. My apartment suddenly felt too small, too vulnerable. I grabbed my phone, staring at the screen, debating whether to call someone. The police? My mother? But what would I even say? The man gave me a note in my missing father's handwriting. Please help. They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, even if an officer came by, interviewed me, what could they do? This wasn't just about a missing person. This was about someone who didn't want to be found. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside my head. I needed to be rational, logical. I needed to do what my father had done. I needed to disappear. I packed a small bag, just the essentials: cash, a change of clothes, my passport. Then, I did something I never thought I would. I pulled the SIM card from my phone, snapped it in half, and dropped it in the sink. Then, I turned on the faucet and let the water carry the tiny pieces down the drain. No more tracking, no more calls. I wasn't taking any chances. I didn't leave right away, that would be too obvious. Instead, I waited until just before dawn, when the streets were empty, when the city was quiet. I kept my hood up, my head down. I walked in the opposite direction of my office, of my usual coffee shop, of anywhere someone might expect me to go. I went to the train station, bought a ticket to a city I had never been to, and when the train doors slid shut behind me, I exhaled for the first time in hours. But as I stared out the window, watching the skyline shrink into the distance, one thought refused to leave my mind. Was it over? Or had I just put myself one step closer to whatever my father had been running from? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to find out. And if I was smart, I never would. That was 2 years ago. I don't live in the same city anymore. I don't use my real name. I don't stay in one place for too long. I still don't know what my father was caught up in, and I don't ask. I don't search for him. And if he's out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting, making sure I listened, I hope he knows that I did. Because I don't want to know the truth anymore. I just want to be left alone. And I hope, God, I hope they let me.
I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was slow, deliberate. 3 taps, followed by silence. For a moment I thought I had imagined it. My phone read 3:12 a.m., the kind of hour where the world feels empty, where sleep is too heavy to wake from without reason. Then the knocks came again. I pushed off the blanket, my skin prickling with unease. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I hadn't been expecting anyone. No one would come by this late. I hesitated at the door, heart hammering against my ribs. Then finally I unlocked it. And there she was. Emily. Thin, pale. Her clothes were loose on her frame, her hair tangled and falling over her face. She looked exhausted, like she had been walking for days, maybe longer. I froze. My chest felt tight, like my body couldn't decide if I should be relieved or terrified. My sister had been missing for 6 months. No trace, no leads, no answers. And now she was standing in front of me, like nothing had happened. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily. She didn't speak. Her eyes met mine, but something about them was wrong. Emily always had this warmth to her, this subtle kindness that made people feel at ease. But the girl standing in front of me felt empty. Her expression was flat, her gaze hollow. I reached for her arm. She didn't flinch, didn't react at all. Her skin was cold. I pulled her inside, shutting the door quickly behind us. "Where have you been?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the silence. She just stood there. Her lips parted slightly, like she was about to speak, but no words came out. I stared at her, waiting. The air between us stretched thin, the weight of 6 months pressing down on me. Then, in the quietest voice, she said, "I don't remember. I didn't sleep." Emily sat on the couch, staring at nothing, arms folded in her lap like she didn't know what to do with them. She wouldn't answer my questions, wouldn't explain where she had been. She had no memory of anything past the night she disappeared. It didn't make sense. The police had searched for months. There were posters all over town. My parents had drained their savings hiring private investigators. And just like that, she was back. I studied her carefully. Her nails were too clean. Her skin, though pale, wasn't sunburned or scarred or dirty. There were no bruises, no marks, no evidence of anything happening to her at all. If she had been lost, wouldn't she look more damaged? More human? I made her tea, something warm to calm her down, but she wouldn't drink it. She wouldn't eat either. I set a plate in front of her, the same meal she used to love grilled cheese and tomato soup. She didn't even look at it. I called our parents. My mother sobbed so hard she couldn't speak. My father barely said a word, only that they would be on the next flight out. When I got off the phone, Emily was exactly where I had left her, sitting completely still. She hadn't blinked. "Do you need anything?" I asked, feeling like I was talking to a stranger. She turned her head too slowly. Her eyes met mine, and I felt something crawl beneath my skin, a primal instinct screaming that something was wrong. Then, softly, "I want to go home." I nodded. "Mom and Dad will be here soon." She didn't react to that. I tried again. "You can stay here tonight, and we'll go to the house in the morning." Emily smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Okay." Something about that single word sent a chill through me. That night I couldn't sleep. I left my bedroom door cracked open, listening for any sound. Emily's breathing was too quiet. No shifting, no rustling of blankets. It was as if she wasn't even in there. At exactly 3 a.m. I heard it. A faint creaking sound. I tensed, sitting up in bed. The apartment was dark, but something felt off. The air was too heavy, pressing against my chest like a warning. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the door. The hallway was dimly lit by the streetlights outside, casting faint slivers of light through the blinds. Then I saw her. She was standing in the hallway, motionless, staring at the wall. I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat felt dry. "Emily?" She didn't turn. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening on the door frame. "What are you doing?" A long pause. Then her head tilted slightly. Not like a normal head, tilt too slow, too deliberate. Her back was to me, her arms limp at her sides. I took a small step forward, my skin crawling. The way she was standing, it didn't feel natural. Like she was waiting. Then she spoke. But it wasn't a response. It was a question. "Do you hear them?" My stomach dropped. I felt my skin prickle, the tiny hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Who?" I whispered. She didn't move, didn't blink. Just stood there, staring at the wall. Then, in a voice too flat, too empty, she said, "They followed me home." I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't Emily. Or if it was, something else came back with her. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing in the hallway, her back to me, staring at nothing. Her voice played over and over in my head, flat and emotionless. "They followed me home." I kept telling myself I misheard her, that I was too exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong with Emily. The next morning, she sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She hadn't touched the food I left her the night before. She hadn't even moved the plate. Her eyes flicked toward me as I entered the room, but she didn't speak. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, keeping my voice light. She blinked, as if the question was confusing. "Yes." I waited for more, but she just sat there, too still, as if waiting for something. I cleared my throat. "Mom and Dad's flight lands in a few hours. We'll drive to the house after that, okay?" She nodded. It felt rehearsed. I tried not to shiver as I sat across from her. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to ask what she meant last night, why she was awake, why she was just standing there. But I was afraid of what she might say. So instead, I reached for my coffee, watching her carefully over the rim of the mug. She wasn't blinking. She was looking past me, her gaze fixed on the space right behind my shoulder. I felt my stomach tighten. I turned my head, expecting to see nothing. But for a split second, just 1 second, I thought I saw movement. A flicker of something, too fast to register. I turned back to Emily, my pulse hammering. She was still staring, but now a small, thin smile had crept onto her face. Like she knew I had seen it too. The drive to our parents' house was quiet. Emily sat in the passenger seat, hands resting in her lap, looking out the window. She hadn't asked where we were going. She hadn't asked about anything. It was like she didn't care. At a red light, I stole a glance at her. Her reflection in the window looked off. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't moving on its own, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. Her mouth looked wrong, like she was whispering something I couldn't hear. Then the light turned green, and when I looked again, her lips were still. I gripped the wheel tighter. I didn't say anything. Mom and Dad were waiting on the porch when we pulled up. The second my mother saw Emily, she burst into tears. My dad held onto her as she sobbed, his face pale and drawn. Emily stepped out of the car slowly. She didn't react to the crying. She didn't smile or hug them, or even acknowledge their emotions at all. She just stood there. "Sweetheart," my mom choked, stepping forward, touching Emily's face. "Where have you been?" Emily's expression didn't change. "I don't remember." My mother clung to her, but Emily didn't return the embrace. She stood there, rigid, her arms at her sides. I saw my father watching her closely, his brows furrowed. He felt it too. Something was wrong. That night, we had dinner together for the first time in 6 months. Or at least we tried to. Emily didn't eat. She sat at the table, staring down at her plate, unmoving. At first we assumed she just wasn't hungry, but then I noticed something. She wasn't even breathing. Her chest didn't rise, her shoulders didn't shift. I dropped my fork, the sound too loud in the silence. Emily turned her head toward me, slowly, like a machine registering movement. I stared at her, my throat dry. "Are you okay?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then so softly I almost didn't hear it. "Do you hear them?" A chill ripped through my spine. I felt my father stiffen beside me. My mother blinked, confused. "Hear what, honey?" Emily's gaze flickered toward the darkened hallway. She smiled. Them. No one slept that night. At 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't Emily. It was coming from the hallway. Low, hushed voices layered over each other. I sat up slowly, my body frozen with fear. The air felt thicker, heavier. Something moved outside my door. A faint shuffle of bare feet against the wooden floor. Then a soft tap. I couldn't breathe. Another tap. Then a third. The same knocking from the night Emily came back. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt wrong, like my body was rejecting the movement. The whispering grew softer, like whoever was speaking was walking away. I reached for the door handle. I didn't want to open it. I knew deep in my bones that if I did, I wouldn't be alone. But I had to see. I had to know. I twisted the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The hallway was dark. At first, it looked empty. Then my eyes adjusted. Emily was standing in the corner. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly to the side. Her arms hung limply at her sides. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. She was just standing there. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like her at all, she said, "They said you shouldn't be awake." Every hair on my body stood on end. I took a step back, my breath hitching. "Emily," I whispered, "who are you talking to?" Slowly, too slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes met mine. And then she smiled. Not like my sister, not like a person at all. It was too wide, too unnatural, too knowing. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she said, "They followed me home." I slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking. My heart was a wild animal in my chest. I pressed my back against the door, listening. But there was only silence. No footsteps. No breathing. Just silence. I didn't sleep. And when morning came, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, smiling, waiting. I didn't mention what happened that night. At breakfast, my parents were still in that surreal state of relief, smiling too much, talking too loudly, pretending everything was fine. They asked Emily if she wanted pancakes, eggs, coffee, offering things she used to love. She didn't eat, didn't even look at the food, just sat there, her hands folded neatly on the table. I barely touched my own plate. I couldn't stop thinking about last night, about the whispers, about Emily standing in the dark, about the way she had smiled at me. She had never smiled like that before. I wanted to tell my parents. I wanted to pull my dad aside and say, "Something's wrong. That's not Emily." But I knew what would happen. They would say she had been through trauma, that I was being paranoid, that she needed time. So I said nothing. That day, my mother finally convinced Emily to go outside for a short walk. It had been 6 months since anyone had seen her, and now, suddenly, she was back, alive, and fine. People in the neighborhood would ask questions. My parents wanted to get ahead of it. I told them I had errands to run. I just needed space. I needed to think. I got in my car and drove into town, gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. My stomach was in knots. My mind kept going in circles. I thought about the way she stared past me, the things she had said in the hallway, the way she never blinked long enough, the way she didn't move naturally. And then something worse. The night before, in the dark, I had heard whispers, but my parents' room was across the house. Emily was the only one in the hallway. So who exactly had been whispering to her? I didn't know where I was going, but somehow I ended up at the police station. I parked and sat there for a long time. I knew how this would sound. My sister came back after going missing for 6 months, and now she won't eat, won't sleep, and stands in the hallway staring at nothing. That wasn't a crime. That wasn't something the police could do anything about. And yet, I had to try. I finally forced myself out of the car, my hands damp with sweat. The station was smaller town, wasn't big enough for a large department. Only 2 officers were at the front desk, one typing something into a computer, the other drinking coffee. I walked up slowly. Hey, I need to ask about a case. My sister, Emily. The officer looked up, frowning slightly. Emily Carter? I nodded. His frown deepened. She was found? Something about the way he said, it bothered me. Yes, she came home 2 nights ago. The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That's surprising. That made my stomach twist. Why? He hesitated. Then finally, because 6 months is a long time for someone to disappear without a trace. And the way it happened? No leads, no evidence. We assumed. He trailed off, choosing his words carefully. I swallowed. You assumed she was dead. He gave a slow nod. I already knew that deep down, but hearing it from someone else made it feel heavier. I took a breath. Something's wrong with her. The officer's brow furrowed. She won't eat. She doesn't sleep. I hesitated. Say it. Say what you saw. She stands in the hallway at night, and she whispers to someone who isn't there. The officer didn't laugh. He didn't even look skeptical. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Whispers. I felt a chill creep down my spine. I heard her last night. She said, "They followed me home." The officer exchanged a glance with the other cop behind the desk. The air shifted, like I had just touched on something I wasn't supposed to. I stiffened. What? The officer looked back at me, lowering his voice. Yours isn't the first case like this. I felt like I was going to be sick. He gestured for me to sit, but I shook my head. I needed to stand. I needed air. He kept his voice low, calm, like he was explaining something delicate. There have been others, not a lot, but enough to notice. I stared at him. Others who disappeared and came back wrong. A slow nod. I swallowed. Who? He hesitated. You remember the Clark kid, David? I did. He had gone missing 2 years ago. His parents searched everywhere. Then one day, he just came back. I had forgotten about it until now. Something clicked in my head. David doesn't talk anymore. The officer nodded. My stomach clenched. David had been normal before, but when he came back, he just stopped speaking. People said it was trauma. I had never thought much about it. The officer continued. There were a couple of others, not as public. One woman, Beth Sanders, went missing for 3 months. Showed up again like nothing happened. Same as your sister. No memory of where she'd been. Wouldn't eat. Wouldn't talk. Then a few weeks later. He stopped. I leaned in. Then what? He hesitated before saying, she disappeared again, this time for good. A chill rippled through me. The officer exhaled, rubbing his temples. There's a pattern, but no explanation. No bodies, no leads. Just people vanishing, coming back, and then disappearing forever. I felt lightheaded. Emily was part of this. I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't do something, she was going to vanish again. And this time, I wouldn't get her back. I drove home too fast, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I needed to talk to Emily. I needed her to tell me where she had been. I pulled into the driveway, barely remembering the drive. The house was still. The sky was darkening. My parents' car was gone. They must have gone out to pick up groceries or something. I stepped inside. The house was silent. Too silent. I walked down the hall toward Emily's room. The door was open. I stepped inside and stopped cold. Emily was standing in front of the mirror, not moving, not blinking, just staring. Her reflection was off. I couldn't explain why, but something about the way she was standing in the mirror didn't match reality. Then, without turning, without blinking, she said, "They don't want me to remember." My breath hitched. "Who?" I whispered. She smiled. Then she turned to look at me. And in the mirror, her reflection stayed facing forward. I didn't move. I couldn't. Emily stood in front of the mirror, her head slightly tilted, her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Her body had turned toward me, but her reflection hadn't moved. It was still facing forward. I felt a deep, instinctual panic claw up my spine, the kind of primal fear that had nothing to do with logic. "Emily," I said, my voice barely a whisper. What are you doing?" She blinked slowly, like she was just waking up. Then she glanced at the mirror, almost confused, as if she had just noticed it herself. Then finaler reflection moved. She turned to look at me, her eyes blank. "They don't want me to remember." My mouth went dry. "Who?" Her expression stayed neutral, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then she took a step forward. I took one back. Her eyes flickered slightly, like she had noticed the way I reacted. The smile returned, small and faint, but wrong. I forced myself to swallow the panic rising in my chest. "Emily, where were you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted a single hand and touched her stomach. "Empty," she murmured. A chill ran through me. "What?" She blinked. "I'm always empty." Something about the way she said it made my stomach clench. Then her fingers curled slightly, digging into her shirt, pressing into her skin like she was trying to feel something that wasn't there. I wanted to step forward, to stop her, to shake her, and make her answer me. But I was too afraid. I didn't know what would happen if I touched her. I didn't know if Emily was really Emily anymore. I barely spoke at dinner. Mom and Dad were still caught up in the shock of having her back, talking about therapy, doctors, helping her adjust. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't see the way Emily just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't eat. Didn't even touch the food. Again. She just stared at her plate, her eyes unfocused, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Mom placed a gentle hand on her wrist. "Sweetheart, do you want something else? I can make anything you want." Emily blinked too slowly. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "I don't need food anymore." I set my fork down. The room felt too quiet. Dad cleared his throat. "Well, that's okay, Em. Maybe you're just not feeling great. It's a lot to adjust to." She smiled. "Yes." I wanted to scream. Couldn't they see how unnatural this was? Couldn't they tell that something was wrong? I pushed my chair back abruptly. "I need some air." Mom gave me a look, like she knew something was bothering me, but she didn't push. Emily turned her head slightly to watch me leave. The moment I stepped into the hallway, my legs nearly gave out. I leaned against the wall, breathing hard, my pulse hammering. Something was happening. Something terrible. Emily wasn't Emily, and I had no idea how to stop it. That night, I did something I knew I shouldn't. I stayed awake. I sat in my bed with the lights off, staring at the sliver of light under my door, waiting. I needed proof. I needed to know I wasn't imagining things. At 3:04 a.m., I heard it. Soft, steady footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. They weren't coming toward my door. They were going outside. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible, creeping toward the window. Outside, bathed in the faint glow of the porch light, was Emily. She was standing in the middle of the yard, completely still. Her head was tilted upward, her arms limp at her sides. She stood there for a long time, unmoving. Then, without warning, she took one slow step forward. Then another. She was walking toward the woods. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding. I needed to wake my parents up. I needed to do something. Then, just before she disappeared into the trees, she stopped. Her body froze mid-step. I felt my breath hitch. She stood like that, frozen in place, for what felt like forever. Then, with an unnatural smoothness, she turned her head toward my window. I ducked back instantly, my chest heaving. Did she see me? Did she know I was watching? I swallowed back the panic rising in my throat and forced myself to look again. Emily was still there. But now, she wasn't alone. Something else was standing just behind her. It was too tall. Not freakishly so, but wrong enough to notice. A silhouette barely visible in the dark. No defining features, no face. Just a shape, standing right behind Emily. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Then Emily smiled, and she started walking again. Into the woods. With it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run outside and drag her back. But I couldn't move. I could only watch. She disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the shadows. And the moment she was gone, the air in my room felt lighter, like something had been pressing against my chest all night, and now it was finally gone. I staggered back from the window, my heart hammering. What the hell was happening? I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor by the door, waiting for Emily to come back. I kept telling myself I would wake Mom and Dad, that I would tell them everything. But when the sun finally started to rise, and I heard the front door creak open, I felt frozen. Emily's bare feet padded softly across the floor. She walked straight down the hall, straight into her room, like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just spent the night in the woods with something that wasn't human. I forced myself to move, stepping out into the hallway. Her door was open just a crack. I peered inside. Emily was sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap. Her skin looked even paler than before. Then she lifted her head, and for the first time, she looked tired. Like whatever had kept her going since she came back was finally wearing off. She blinked, slow and heavy. Then she turned to me. In a whisper, she said, "I don't think I was supposed to come back." I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Emily sat there on the edge of her bed, her posture too still, too unnatural. She blinked slowly, her expression unreadable. "I don't think I was supposed to come back." Her voice was flat, almost detached, like she was talking about someone else. I stepped into the room cautiously. The morning light cast long shadows across the floor, but she didn't react to the warmth of the sun on her face. She just sat there. "You left last night," I said, my voice barely steady. "I saw you walk into the woods." She didn't blink. I swallowed hard. "Who was with you?" Emily didn't answer right away. Her fingers twitched slightly in her lap, like she was remembering something. Then finally she whispered, "They always follow." A cold shiver ran through me. I sat down in the chair across from her, gripping the edges to steady myself. "Emily," I said carefully, "what happened to you?" Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak right away. She seemed to be searching for an answer, trying to pull something from the depths of her mind that didn't belong there. Then finally, "It's quiet there." I frowned. "Where?" She lifted her head slightly. "Where I was." I didn't breathe. Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "There's no time, no hunger, no pain, just waiting." Her hands gripped the fabric of her pajama pants, knuckles white. "Waiting for what?" I asked. She looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time she looked afraid. For one of us to leave. The word settled in my stomach like a stone. I opened my mouth, but she spoke first. "I think I did something wrong," she said, barely above a whisper. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. "What do you mean?" Her expression shifted. I couldn't explain it, but for a moment she looked lost, like she was somewhere else entirely. I don't think I was the one who was supposed to leave. I left her room in a daze. My parents were downstairs, still groggy, making coffee, talking in quiet voices about how Emily just needs time and how they shouldn't pressure her. They didn't see it. They didn't see what I saw. She wasn't adjusting, she wasn't healing. She was unraveling. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched plate of food from the night before. I thought about what the officer told me. Some of them disappear again, this time for good. The realization hit me all at once. Emily wasn't just going to leave. She was going back. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my room. The door cracked open just enough to see into the hallway. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard movement. Soft footsteps. I didn't hesitate. I got up, moving silently, creeping down the hall toward Emily's door. It was open. The room was empty. I felt my breath hitch. I turned toward the front door. It was unlocked. I stepped outside. Emily was already at the edge of the yard. She was walking toward the woods, her movements slow, deliberate. I felt cold terror settle into my bones. Number. I ran after her. The grass was damp with morning dew, and the air felt thick, unnatural. I caught up to her just before she reached the tree line, grabbing her wrist. "Emily," I gasped, "you can't go back." She turned toward me, but her face was blank. Not confused, not afraid. Just empty. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Her skin was ice cold. I tightened my grip. "Emily, whatever happened to you, whoever took you, you don't have to go back." She blinked once, then twice. Then she whispered something so quiet, I almost didn't hear it. "They won't let me stay." The moment she said it, the air around us shifted. I felt them, the weight of something unseen. The forest ahead of us was too dark, not just the absence of light, but something deeper, like the trees didn't exist beyond a certain point, like the shadows were watching. I turned back toward the house, toward the safety of the lights. The yard looked farther away than it should have been. Too far. Emily's fingers twitched in my grasp. "I shouldn't have come back," she murmured. "It was supposed to be someone else." A cold, crawling horror settled in my stomach. I remembered what she had said that morning. One of us was supposed to stay. Something had been taken in her place. Or someone. I thought about the whispers I had heard at night. I thought about how she never ate, never slept. She wasn't just changing. She was becoming like them. I felt my grip on her wrist weaken. A deep, suffocating fear settled in my chest. If she's already becoming one of them, then who? Her head snapped up, and her eyes met mine. Her pupils were too big. I took a step back. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't holding her wrist anymore. She was holding mine, and her grip was stronger than it should have been. The next morning, my parents woke up to find both of our doors open. Emily was gone. I was still in my bed, cold, shivering, like I had been laying there all night, like I had never gotten up at all. I tried to tell them what happened. I tried to explain. But every time I opened my mouth, my mind went blank. I forgot the words. I forgot the feeling of standing in that yard, of holding her hand, of seeing that thing in the trees. The only thing I remembered was her voice. I wasn't supposed to be the one who left. It's been 2 years. Emily never came back. But sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. for no reason. And when I do, the house feels too quiet, too empty, like something is waiting. And every time I pass by a mirror, for just a second, my reflection moves just a little too late.